Right, we now come to the second statement. I will call the Secretary of State for Defence, Ben Wallace. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As a young officer 30 years ago, almost to the day, I was summoned to the drill square to have read aloud key decisions from the government's defence review of the time, Options for Change. We did not know it then, but the world was set for massive change. The fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, the global impact of the internet and the emergence of Al-Qaeda was some way off, which meant no one was really prepared for what happened when they did. I was part of an army that on paper fielded 3 armoured divisions in Germany, but in reality could muster much less. It was, in truth, a hollow force. That is why, while I know some colleagues would rather play top trumps with our force numbers, there is no point boasting about numbers of regiments when you send them to war in snatched Land Rovers, or simply counting the number of tanks when our adversaries are developing new ways to defeat them. That is why we've put at the heart of the Defence Command Paper the mission to seek out and to understand future threats, and to invest in the capabilities needed so that we can defeat them. Because in defence, it is too tempting to use the shield of sentimentality to protect previous battle-winning but now outdated capabilities. Such sentimentality, when coupled with over-ambition and under-resourcing, leads to even harder consequences down the line. It risks the lives of our people, who are truly our finest asset. It would, of course, similarly endanger our people if we simply wielded a sword of cuts, slicing away the battle proven on the promise of novelty, without regard for what is left behind. Old capabilities are not necessarily redundant, just as new technologies are not always relevant. We must employ both sword and shield. Because of those of us in government charged to defend the country, we have a duty to protect new domains, as well as continuing investment in the traditional ones, but always adapting to the threat, Mr. Speaker. History shows us time and time again that failing to do so risks irrelevance and defeat. As the threat changes, we must change with it, remaining clear-eyed about what capabilities we retire, why we are doing things, and how they will be replaced. The Prime Minister's vision for the UK in 2030 sees a stronger, more secure, prosperous and resilient union, better equipped for a more competitive age as a problem-solving and burden-sharing nation with a global perspective. To become so requires Britain's soft and hard power to be better integrated. In this more competitive age, a golden Britain has no choice but to step up, ready to take on the challenges and shape the opportunities of the years ahead, alongside our allies and friends. Let us be clear. The benefits and institutions of multilateralism, to which we have all become so accustomed, are an extension, not an alternative, for our shared leadership and our hard power. UK diplomacy should work hand in hand with the UK armed forces abroad, and we will invest in our defence diplomacy network in order to strengthen the influence we can bring to bear. And at this point, Mr. Speaker, I wish to pay tribute to all our civil servants in the department and further afield in defence, whose professionalism and dedication is every bit as vital to UK security as all the other component parts of the defence enterprise. Likewise, in the past, we have been too tempted to fund equipment at the expense of our service personnel's lived experience. That is why, over the next 4 years, we will spend £1.5 billion on improving single living accommodation and £1.4 billion on wraparound childcare over the next decade. The government's commitment to spending £188 billion on defence over the coming next 4 years, an increase of £24 billion or 14%, is an investment in the Prime Minister's vision of security and prosperity in 2030. Previous reviews have been overambitious and underfunded, leaving forces that were overstretched and under-equipped. This increased funding offers defence an exciting opportunity to turn our current forces into credible ones, modernising for the threats of the 2020s and beyond, and contributing to national prosperity in the process. It marks a shift from mass mobilisation to information age speed, readiness and relevance for confronting the threats of the future. These principles will guide our doctrine and our force development. The integrated operating concept, published last year, recognises that changes in the information and political environments now impact not just the context but conduct of military operations. The notion of war and peace as binary states have given way to a continuum of conflict, requiring us to prepare our forces for more persistent global engagement and constant campaigning, moving seamlessly from operating to warfighting if that is required. The armed forces, working with the rest of government, must think and act differently. They will no longer be held as a force of last resort, but become a more present and active force around the world. Our forces will still be able to warfight as their primary function, but they also will have a role to play before and after what we traditionally consider as war, whether that is supporting humanitarian projects, conflict prevention and stabilisation, or United Nations peacekeeping. But technological proliferation, Mr. Speaker, use of proxies and adversaries operating below the threshold of open conflict means that the United Kingdom must also play a role in countering such aggressive acts. So the steps to sustaining UK leadership in defence must start with ensuring we are a credible and truly threat-orientated organisation. We must do so in conjunction with our allies and friends. These reforms today will ensure that we continue to meet our NATO commitments on land and enhance our contributions at sea. As the second biggest spender in NATO and a major contributor across all 5 domains, we have a responsibility to support the Alliance's own transformation for this more competitive age. So today I'm setting out in this Defence Command paper the threats we are facing, our operating concept for countering them, and the investments in our forces that are required to deliver the nation's defences. That threat demands that we make the following investments and adjustments to the services. We have been a maritime nation for many, many centuries, Mr. Speaker, and it is vital that we have a Navy that is both global and powerful. The Royal Navy, because of our investment in the Type 26, Type 31 and Type 32, will by the start of next decade have over 20 frigates and destroyers. We will also commission a new multi-role ocean surveillance ship, which will protect the integrity of the UK's maritime zones and undersea critical national infrastructure. We will deploy new automated mine hunting systems, which will replace the Sandown and Hunt classes as they retire through the decade. The interim surface-to-surface guided weapon will replace the Typhoon missile, and we will upgrade the air defence weapon system on our Type 45s to better protect them from new threats. We will invest further to implement the availability of our submarine fleet and start development of the next generation of subsea systems for the 2040s. The Royal Marines will develop from being an amphibious infantry held at readiness to a forward-based, highly capable maritime for future commando force, further enabled by the conversion of a Bay-class landing ship to enable littoral strike. Our land forces have been for too long deprived of investment, and that is why over the next 4 years we will spend £23 billion on their modernisation. The British Army will reorganise into 7 brigade combat teams, 2 heavy, 1 deep strike, 1 air manoeuvre and 2 light, plus a combat aviation brigade. In addition, a newly formed Security Force Assistance Brigade will provide the skills and capabilities to build the capacity of partner nations. In recognition of the growing demand for enhanced assistance and our commitment to delivering resilience to those partners, we will establish an Army Special Operations Brigade built around the 4 battalions of the new Ranger Regiment. This new regiment will be seeded from 1 Royal Scots, 2 Prince of Wales Royal Rifles, 2nd Battalion Duke of Lancs and 4th Battalion the Rifles. Our adversaries set a premium on rapid deployability, so we will enhance the existing 16 Air Assault Brigade with an additional infantry unit supported by upgraded Apache attack helicopters. Together, they will create a global response force for both crisis response and warfighting. The 3rd Division will remain the heart of our warfighting capability, leading in NATO with 2 modernised heavy brigades. In order to ensure we are more lethal and better protected, they will be built around a modern armoured nucleus of 148 upgraded Challenger 3 tanks, Ajax armoured reconnaissance vehicles and the accelerated introduction of Boxer armoured personnel carriers. As I have repeatedly said, recent lessons from conflicts in Libya, Syria and the Caucasus have shown the vulnerability of armour. So we will increase both manning and investments in electronic warfare regiments, air defence and uncrewed aerial surveillance systems, all complemented by offensive cyber capabilities. The Army's increased deployability and technological advantage will mean that greater effect can be delivered by fewer people. I've therefore taken the decision to reduce the size of the Army from today's current strength of 76,500 trade-trained personnel to 72,500 by 2025. The Army has not been at its established strength of 82,000 since the middle of last decade. These changes will not require redundancies, and we wish to build on the work already done on utilising our reserves to make sure the whole force is better integrated and more productive. There will be no loss of CAT badges, and as I've said earlier, the new structures will require fewer units, and therefore the 2nd Battalion, the Mercian Regiment, will be amalgamated with the 1st Battalion to form a new Boxer-mounted battalion. To administer the new infantry, we will reorganise the regiments to sit in 4 infantry divisions. Each will comprise a more balanced number of battalions and give the men and women serving in them a wider range of choices and opportunities in pursuing their careers and specialties. In order to ensure that there is a balanced allocation of recruits, we will introduce intelligent recruiting for the infantry, and each division of infantry will initially feed the 4 new Ranger battalions. The final details of these administrative divisions, along with the wider Army restructuring, will be announced before the summer, and no major unit deletions further will be required. Today's Royal Air Force is now deploying world-leading capabilities: P-8, rivet joint, A400M and the latest Typhoons. The F-35, the world's most capable combat aircraft, is now being deployed to frontline squadrons. In recognition of its battle-winning capabilities, we will commit to grow the fleet between 48 aircraft. The E-3D Sentry, 2 generations behind its contemporaries, will be replaced by a more capable fleet of 3 E-7 Wedgetail in 2023. These will be based at RAF Lossiemouth, transforming the United Kingdom early warning and control capabilities, as well as contributing to NATO. As the transport fleet improves availability, we will retire the C-130J Hercules in 2023 after 24 years' service. 22 A400Ms alongside the C-17s will provide a more capable and flexible transport fleet. Our counter-terrorism operations are currently supported by 9 Reaper drones, which will be replaced by Protectors in 2024. These new platforms will provide the enhanced strategic ISR and strike capabilities that are so vital for all our forces. All forces evolve, and the increasingly competitive and complex air environment means we must set the foundations now for our 6th generation of fighter. The Typhoon has been a tremendous success for the British aerospace industry, and we will seek to repeat that with £2 billion of investment in the future combat air systems over the next 4 years, alongside further development of the Lanka UCAV system. We will continue to seek further international collaboration. All services recognise the importance of unmanned aerial systems, which is why we'll also develop combat drone swarm technologies. But in order to ensure our current platforms have the necessary protection and lethality, we will also upgrade the Typhoon radar and introduce Spearcat 3 deep strike capabilities. The lessons of current conflict, Mr. Speaker, demonstrate that however capable individual forces may be, they are vulnerable without integration. US Strategic Command will therefore invest $1.5 billion over the next decade to build and sustain a digital backbone to share and exploit vast amounts of data through the cloud and secure networks. To ensure our workforce are able to exploit new domains and enhance productivity, the Command will invest in synthetics and simulation, providing a step change in our training. The National Cyber Force will lie at the heart of defence and GCHQ's offensive cyber capability and will be based in the northwest of England. Keeping overseas informed of the threat, Mr. Speaker, and ahead of our rivals means that defence intelligence will be at the heart of our enterprise. We will exploit a wider network of advanced surveillance platforms, all classifications of data, and enhance and analysing using artificial intelligence. Strategic Command will partner alongside the RAF to deliver a step change in our space capabilities. From next year, we will start delivering a UK-built intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance satellite constellation. Space is just one area in which the Ministry of Defence will prioritise more than £6.6 billion of research development and experimentation over the next 4 years. These investments in our future battle-winning capabilities will be guided by the Science and Technology Strategy of 2020 and new Defence and Security Industrial Strategy published tomorrow. Our Special Forces are world-leading. We are committed to investing in their cutting-edge capabilities to ensure they retain their excellence in counter-terrorism, while becoming increasingly capable of also countering hostile state activity. To conclude, Mr. Speaker, if this Defence Command Paper is anything, it is an honest assessment of what we can do and what we will do. We will ensure defence is threat-focused, modernised and financially sustainable, ready to confront future challenges, seize new opportunities for global Britain, and lay the foundations of a more secure and prosperous United Kingdom. We will, for the first time in decades, match genuine money to credible ambitions. We will retire platforms to make way for new systems and approaches. And we will invest in the most precious commodity of all, the people of our armed forces. To serve my country as a soldier was one of the greatest privileges of my life. Serving to lead, contributing to keeping this country safe, upholding our values, and defending those who cannot defend themselves. Putting yourself in harm's way in the service of your country is something that, fortunately, few of us are ever required to do. But we all have a duty to ensure that those who do so on our behalf are as well prepared and as equipped as well as possible. So the success of this Defence Command Paper should not be judged on the sophistication of its words, but on the implementation of its reforms, and ultimately on the delivery of its capabilities into the hands of the men and women of the armed forces. It is they who keep us safe, Mr. Speaker, and will continue to do so in the years ahead. It is to them, their families, and all those across defence that we owe it to make this policy into a reality. The work to do has only just begun. Thank you.
We now come to the Shadow Secretary of State, John Healey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary of State for the advanced copy of his statement and the advanced copy of the White Paper a little earlier. Though I believe, Mr. Speaker, that the House will share my dismay that so much of the content of this White Paper had been given in advance to the media over the last week, despite your warning to the House and to the Defence Secretary last Monday. Our forces deserve better. Public and Parliament deserve better. This defence review, Mr. Speaker, could not be more important. Last year we were promised, and I quote, the most radical reassessment of the UK's place in the world since the end of the Cold War. We need just that. The integrated review last week confirmed, and I quote, state threats to the UK and our allies are growing and diversifying. And the Secretary of State was right in the defence review today to detail grey zone warfare, terrorism, climate change, organised crime, which mean that the threats to our national security and to international stability are becoming less conventional, less predictable, more continuous. We need this reassessment, Mr. Speaker, because the last two Conservative defence reviews have weakened the foundations of our armed forces. Cut our full-time armed forces by 45,000, cut the defence budget by £8 billion, cut critical defence capabilities and upgrades largely to deal with budget pressures. Now, the Prime Minister promised an end to this era of retreat. The Defence Secretary pledged this review would be different. Yet I fear this defence review is set to repeat many of the same mistakes. The strength of our armed forces cut again. Crucial military capabilities cut again. Plans to complete a full overhaul of the Army, 10 years' time, again. So how, can I say to the Secretary of State, does the government square this circle? The threats to Britain are increasing, our forces will be forward deployed further from home, yet this is a plan for fewer troops, fewer ships, fewer planes over the next few years. Now, our armed forces are rightly respected worldwide for their professionalism and their all-round excellence. But size matters. Our full-time forces are already nearly 10,000 below the strength that ministers said in 2015 was needed to meet the threats Britain faces. And the Defence Secretary goes further today, confirming the Army alone will have its established strength cut by 10,000 to just 72,500 over the next 4 years. How can the Secretary of State argue that these deeper cuts will not limit our forces' capacity simultaneously to deploy overseas, support allies, maintain strong national defences, and also reinforce domestic resilience, as they have been helping our country through the recent COVID crisis? What does he say to the ex-Chief of the Defence Staff, General Sir David Richards, who recently said further cuts to the Army would mean the UK was, I quote, no longer taken seriously as a military power, and that this would damage our relationship with the US and our position in NATO? And what does the Defence Secretary say to each and every voter who heard the Prime Minister say at the launch of the Conservatives' 2019 election campaign, I quote, "We will not be cutting our armed forces in any form. We will be maintaining the size of our armed services"? Mr. Speaker, we welcome the plans announced today for cyber, for space, for defence science, for artificial intelligence, for the next generation of fighter jets. But these new technologies may take years to come on stream. So this is a plan for cuts now with a promise of jam tomorrow. Let me ask the Defence Secretary a series of questions. When will the warfighting division, promised in 2015, finally be battle ready? When will we have enough British F-35 jets to fly from our aircraft carriers? Will there be any short-term cut in anti-submarine warfare capabilities? How will the new Rangers Regiment be recruited? Where will it be based, and when will it be fully operational? Will the plans for the combat service support battalions mean any reduction in the number of Army medics? And finally, just to say to the Secretary of State, wasn't going to raise this, but on funding for the single living accommodation, the Secretary of State has said today, as the MOD has told the NAO, that the plans for 1.5 billion over 10 years, but the white paper says 1.3 billion on page 36. So perhaps he could say to the House, is that a cut or is that an error? Turning to MOD finances, Mr. Speaker. The finances for the last defence review were a fiction. The MOD budget was balanced in 2012, but the NAO has now judged the defence equipment plan unaffordable for 4 years in a row and reports a black hole of up to £17 billion. We welcomed the Prime Minister's extra £16.5 billion, Mr. Speaker, but there's a risk we'll be throwing good money after bad. How much of this extra money will be swallowed by the black hole in the current programmes and not used to fund the new ones he's announced today? The ministers talk about the rise in capital funding, but not the real cut in revenue funding over the next 4 years. This cut in day-to-day spending is the Achilles heel of defence plans. The Secretary of State should never have agreed it. So will he today spell out the consequences of this real terms cut in revenue funding for forces recruitment, training, pay and family support? Mr. Speaker, the MOD's bad habits run deep. Only 3 of the MOD's 30 major projects, together worth a staggering £162 billion, have a clear green light, on time and on budget. And it's clear to me that Parliament needs a system of special measures for the MOD. The Secretary of State's new Office for Net Assessment and Challenge will deal with policy, but not money or delivery. So will the Defence Secretary commission a special capability review of the MOD, conducted by a top team of internal and external experts backed by the NAO and reporting to this House? Mr. Speaker, on nuclear, Labour's commitment to the renewal of our deterrent is non-negotiable alongside our multilateral commitment to nuclear disarmament and to greater arms control. He makes no mention in his statement of reversing 30 years of the UK's proud non-proliferation policy under successive governments. And the White Paper does not come close to explaining, let alone justifying, this change. So I say to him, Parliament, the public and our allies are owed a much fuller account of this decision from ministers. Mr. Speaker, the White Paper also has little to say on the lessons from the COVID. Pandemic was indeed identified as a Tier 1 threat in 2015 and in 2018, but no preparation was done, and when the virus hit, less than 1% of our PPE was sourced in the UK. Full spectrum society resilience requires training, planning, exercising that must be led by the government and involve private industry, local agencies and the public. And some countries are ahead of us with such civil military strategies. For the grey zone, why does the White Paper have nothing to do to catch Britain up? And then finally, Mr. Speaker, on the principal threats, China is certainly a growing great power challenge that the US, backed by democratic countries like Britain, must meet. However, the White Paper rightly confirms Russia remains Britain's greatest state threat. Our highest priority must therefore be Europe, the North Atlantic and the High North, our NATO area. So while the Prime Minister talks up Britain's Indo-Pacific focus, how does the Defence Secretary reassure NATO that we're not neglecting the leading role that our alliance countries, including the US, continue to require of Britain? And finally, we want to see this defence review succeed, but there's a growing gulf between the government's ambitions and its actions, which we will challenge hard in the months ahead, and he has much more to do to close.
Oh dear, Mr. Speaker. I've suddenly got the impression that no matter what I brought today to this House, that speech would have been trucked out. I mean, this is not a defence review that usually takes part amongst an environment of cuts. The right honourable gentleman is wrong. There is not a cut to Ardell over the 4 years. It is flat, if not a tiny increase in Ardell. So slightly undermines the desperate attempt to make £24 billion plus look like some form of cut. The right honourable member asks what impact that will have. Well, first of all, that will mean 1.5 billion, and there is an insert. He obviously got the paper electronically delivered, but there's an insert, or should be in the printed ones, that show it is actually 1.5, not 1.3 billion. The impact of that Ardell is obviously wraparound childcare for 1.4 billion over 10 years. That's a plus, in case anyone missed it from the tone of the right honourable gentleman's speech. And when it comes to the MOD budget, I've been very honest in this House. I would admit the role former Conservative governments have taken in defence reviews. I have never once heard the right honourable gentleman opposite at all own up to admit that the government he served in produced the 2010 NAO audit report that showed £38 billion of overspend. I've never heard $3 billion in the last year. I've never heard the members of that department themselves, the honourable gentleman shouting from his secondary position, himself was a minister in the Department of Defence. I've never heard them come and say, under our government, we delivered lots of regiments, but we delivered our soldiers into snatch Land Rovers. I've never had that government, those members of that party, come and say, with some sense of apology or humility, that they went to war with soldiers ill-equipped, ill-trained and unable to often make the peace. That's important. That's really important. Because behind all this, Mr. Speaker, are the men and women of our armed forces, and that's why what this tries to do is strike the balance between our ambition, the funding, and looking after those people. We are all ambitious in defence to do more around the world, but if I let my enthusiasm get away with me, I would end up hollowing out the equipment the men and women of the armed forces have. And that is no legacy to leave those people. It's also why, in this blueprint for a future force, we are setting out almost two parts of forces. Forces for warfighting and forces to prevent conflict or help rebuild countries afterwards. Because what we know is you can win the conflict because you usually do it with allies. You can deploy your armoured divisions or brigade, and the right honourable friend is wrong. In Telek 1, it wasn't actually a division. It was 2 armoured brigades, 1 16 commando and 3 commando brigade that deployed.
A Russian armoured division has 3 brigades.
Well, if you want to see what happened to a Russian armoured division, Mr. Speaker, look what happened in Syria in the weeks last year when 172 tanks were wiped out by Turkish UAVs. I wonder what comfort that would have been to the 3,000 Syrian soldiers who no doubt thought, fighting for the wrong regime, however, but no doubt thought that somehow their mass gave them protection. But, Mr. Speaker, they weren't Russian. Mr. Speaker, after the war, in China, Russia war, I think it was, a British officer went to observe and saw the machine gun being used for the first time. His report back said, they're not British, we don't need the machine gun. And the rest, Mr. Speaker, was history. And therein lies the fault and the fallacy of defence reform. If you wrap yourself in sentimentality, what you get is a betrayal of the men and women who go to fight. To some other points that the Right Honourable Member raised, we are going to go beyond the 48 F-35 fighters, and we will continue to purchase them until we have decided whether we have the right numbers to continue. At the moment, we are on track to deliver the squadrons required as planned and man our aircraft carriers. There will be no reduction in combat medics as a result of these reorganisations. Him and I both know the importance, Mr. Speaker, of the role they have played in COVID, and indeed they are a key enabler that will not only be useful for ourselves, but also in those areas when it comes to conflict prevention and winning the peace. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the nuclear deterrent, we do not believe that the changes to the number of warheads in any way breaches the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and that is also advice backed up by the Attorney General. Of course, if the Right Honourable Gentleman is correct about his party's newfound love of the nuclear deterrent since his previous leader, or indeed since the Shadow Foreign Secretary herself voted against renewing it, then he will of course agree with me that if he is going to have a nuclear deterrent, it should be credible. Otherwise, it would just be a massive waste of money, which I know the member from the Scottish Nationalist Party predictably was going to say. I do remember the former leader of the Labour Party, I think, suggesting to the good people of Barrow that they would be allowed to continue to make submarines and maybe use them for tourism purposes instead. Maybe that is the true version of the Labour Party's manifesto on defence. Mr. Speaker, I would take on board many of the criticisms and the charges by the Right Honourable Gentleman opposite if he came to this House with a mea culpa about his own government's role in producing defence reviews over time that were both over-ambitious and underfunded. If he accepted that when we over-sentimentalise our armed forces or avoid to take the tough decisions, the people that suffer in the end are actually the men and women of those armed forces. And if he came here to acknowledge that the men and women of the armed forces that I served with, some of whom who perished in things like snatch Land Rovers, did so because in the end we overstretched, underfunded, and failed to recognise that the best thing to be is an honest, well-funded armed forces, but we don't overstretch and we're not over-ambitious, Mr. Speaker.
Chair of the Select Committee, Tobias Selwood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With your indulgence, could I just pay tribute to PC Keith Palmer, who was killed on this day 4 years ago. Mr. Speaker, there's much to welcome in this command paper here today, and the Defence Secretary should be congratulated for advancing our force structure, for investments in cyber, SF and autonomous platforms. But they come at a huge price to our conventional defence posture, with dramatic cuts to our troop numbers, tanks, armoured fighting vehicles and over 100 RAF aircraft, including fast jets and heavy lift. Cuts which, if tested by a parliamentary vote, I don't believe would pass. Why? Because the government's own integrated review paper spells out in very clear language how dangerous this next decade will be, more so than in the Cold War, where defence spending was plus 4% GDP. Today, we face multiple complex threats to our security and our prosperity, yet our defence spend remains at a peacetime level of just 2.2%. Mr. Speaker, with international rivalry increasing, Western influence on the retreat, we must wake up to how dangerous the next decade will be. Is it not the time to increase the defence budget to 3%, so these dangerous cuts to our conventional hard power can be avoided?
Mr. Speaker, asking any Defence Secretary, any in history, if he would like to support an increase in his budget is only usually going to get one response. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, I am dealing with the budget that I believe is incredibly generous compared to my other colleagues and other departments in the middle of this pandemic. Indeed, many people object to the increase in defence budget. It is a defence budget big enough, Madam Deputy Speaker, to allow me to both fix the issues of the past and invest in modernisation. I understand my right honourable friend's concerns, and I think my answer to him would be about ambition. How ambitious do we want to be? How ambitious and how global do we wish to be? I don't believe that our security is at threat by this document. I think it puts a very good foundation of our homeland security. So what comes next is how much do we help our friends around the world and what ambition we have for that. I can give him the assurance that number one, and I'd say also to the right honourable gentleman opposite, of our defence priorities is our commitment and membership to NATO, because that coalition, that part of the world, the Western Europe and the Atlantic is of course key to our own very own security, and that comes first, as does our nuclear deterrent for us in this side of the House as being our guarantor for security from aggressive states. And that may be where he and I will disagree, and we will no doubt explore it during the Defence Committee meetings about to what extent our ambitions are matched. I feel that where we are today, that we can match our ambitions with this defence paper. But as I've always said in this House, if the threat changes, then we should be always prepared to change with it. I cannot say what will happen in 2035. I cannot say what will happen even further out from there. And that's why I think at the heart of this paper is something that him and I do strongly agree, that it should for once be threat-driven. That should drive what we buy. That should drive how we equip our people. That should drive what we do. We are determined to do it, and as Defence Secretary it is my job to provide the rest of government, the Prime Minister and the National Security Council, the range of options and range of tools to allow them to follow those ambitions.
Call the SNP spokesperson, Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Secretary for advance sight of both the paper and his statement, and apologise to him for the difficulties we had trying to get each other on the phone earlier. And as the Select Committee Chair has said, on behalf of these benches, can I acknowledge the anniversary of the death of PC Keith Palmer and acknowledge indeed the Right Honourable Gentleman's own bravery on that day. Can I turn to the paper? In terms of the questions that it asks, I think it does seek to ask some of the right questions. And I can see within the broader context of the integrated review and what the Minister is going to no doubt reveal to us tomorrow, where the government is trying to go. The problem we have with it, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that it comes to some of the wrong conclusions, not least, and let me be unequivocal on this, in terms of the increase in the nuclear stockpile. We think that's an expensive folly that should be cancelled with immediate effect. But in terms of the changing nature of threats, I do think that the document and the Secretary outlines some things that are worth exploring and things that this House should have come to debate far long ago. Indeed, when it comes to, for example, the investment in research as far as space is concerned, that's something that we welcome, not least because my own city of Glasgow produces more satellites than anywhere else in the United Kingdom. But this reliance on technology, which I accept as a new feature of defence and security, particularly on autonomous weapons, does raise some serious concerns, because whilst the government has paraded all of this flashy, expensive new tech, and I understand that members of this House, not just on the governing benches, get very razzle-dazzled with this stuff, what are we going to see come forward in terms of the proper oversight of the use of this technology? We cannot have a situation where killer robots are sent into battlefields, but there is no proper oversight over weapons deployed on our behalf and in our name. And that takes me on to the wider issue of international norms, not just on lethal autonomous weapons, but in terms of data and AI. What is the government doing, not just nationally, but to work with partners internationally to develop international norms on this stuff? I accept Russia and China will always pose a challenge in trying to develop international norms, but I want to hear more about what the government is doing to do so, especially within NATO. And to turn to the armed forces, Madam Deputy Speaker, it has been mentioned rightly, and I suspect we will hear it for the rest of this statement, that the Minister will have some convincing to do here in Parliament, that he's going to be able to retire the old, bring in the new, and not have such a big gap in the middle. But on numbers, can he explain to the House what the impact of the reduction in numbers will mean for the Scottish footprint in 2025? I think I've raised them with it continuously over the last few defence questions, that the 12,500 promise made 7 years ago to Scots has never been met, so we can now assume that as far as those numbers are concerned, it's going to be even further from the promise made by his own party ahead of the 2014 referendum. Not just a breach of that promise, but a breach of his own manifesto commitment. And I accept he's trying to clear up a lot of what his predecessors have done. Indeed, I can partly commend him in being honest with the House on it today. But he does have some convincing to do, not just here, but back in communities that he himself knows well. And can I ask, Madam Deputy Speaker, when will we see something brought forward on terms and conditions for the armed forces? What we want to see is a pay increase for members of the armed forces. We know that 4 in 10 serving personnel don't believe their pay properly reflects their work, and it's work that all of us in here admire. Indeed, I see it in my own constituency during the COVID pandemic in Castlemilk, where we have the vaccination and testing centre there. When will he bring forward a real and proper pay rise? Give them the money they deserve. That's something surely all of us in the House could agree with.
Deputy of State.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the honourable gentleman's concerns, both with reliance on technology and the human in the loop issue. Britain has been one of the leaders in trying to raise those discussions in places like the United Nations to make sure that there is a standard that is acceptable, a moral standard, making sure that there is a human in the loop at nearly all times. I think that is important for reassurance. On AI and data, Britain actually leads within NATO on cyber. It pushed NATO to examine cyber, but not in being the cyber nation. Estonia, Madam Deputy Speaker, is probably one of the greatest cyber nations, although there is a data issue that I'm sure his party would disagree with if you rely on data that much. But fundamentally, it is incredibly important, and Britain's work alongside some of its allies in NATO has pushed NATO to look at both hybrid threats and cyber and start making sure that they reform and modernise to do that. I understand the concerns about numbers of troops and personnel in Scotland. There are over 28,000 people currently in Scotland who directly rely on defence. That's the civil servants, the regulars, the reserves and in industry. There will be an increase when we send the E7 Wedgetails up to Lossiemouth of a few hundred people to work there in that part of the world, which is to be welcome. Decisions exactly on where the Rangers will be and how that will develop will come soon. What I would say to the honourable gentleman is it is a tribute to the Scottish infantry and indeed the Scottish heritage that one Will Scots will become the seed of that Ranger. For him, if anyone who knows Scottish military history, the Lovett Scouts and brave souls like that have set the fierce reputation of Scottish soldiers around the world, and I hope, therefore, that that will be recognised as they go forward. On pay and allowances, I have started a process of reviewing allowances. What I can tell you on the allowances I've already signed off, I chose to protect the lowest paid at the expense of the highest paid, which I'm sure, well, I am not a socialist. I wouldn't be surprised if the honourable member might be. Well, he might not be. But I felt it was important that the lowest paid was protected, as well as with overseas allowances and those individuals with children. Of course, if his government in Scotland would like to pledge giving our troops in Scotland the same £500 bonus they have given the NHS staff, we would be absolutely delighted. Perhaps the extra tax that the SNP layer. I tell you what, Madam Deputy, maybe the honourable gentleman has an opportunity here. I'll do a deal with him. If you cover for 1 year the extra money we pay to mitigate the tax burden that falls on Scottish soldiers, for 1 year, we shall pass that on to them. Would he like to do that now? He has a chance, Madam Deputy Speaker. He has a chance. Oh, I think the Scottish Nationalist Party are busy spending all that money on lawyers, Madam Deputy Speaker.
OK, we're now going to Philip Dunn via video link. Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the clarity of my right honourable friend's statement today, and I look forward to the publication tomorrow of the Defence and Security Industrial Strategy alongside it, which provides, I hope, a degree of coherence, which will be very welcome to all those involved in supporting our armed forces. In light of the necessary decision to proceed with upgrading the warhead for the strategic deterrent, can my right honourable friend explain to the House the rationale for increasing the number of warheads during the transition from one system to the next? And will the cost in developing the strategic deterrent absorb any of the welcome 6.6 billion R&D programme that's been announced?
Secretary of State.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and my right honourable friend laid the foundations for really linking prosperity in a much more deliberate and thoughtful manner into defence and defence procurement, and I hope he will see that reflected in the strategy tomorrow. It is, of course, welcome that this review brings more prosperity, with the investment in boxes to be made in places like Telford, Ajax and Merthyr Tydfil, a Challenger upgrade, and the commitment to a next generation of aerospace. And as a Lancashire MP, the importance of Typhoon, the prosperity that has given us all in my part of the world, is incredibly important. On the rationale of the deterrent, it cannot be taken in a one-sided view. You have to look across at our adversary, at Russia, to see the investments that they have made and their plans to both, as we noticed in 2018, break the intermediate nuclear treaty, which was broken in 2018, their investments in new weapon systems, but also in missile defence. If we're going to keep it as credible, then we need to make sure we do so. When it comes to the R&D budget, the 6.6 billion, I am not aware, and I will write to him and correct if it is the case, that 6.6 billion is anything to do with the nuclear warhead programme or anything else. For clarity, Madam Deputy Speaker, the United Kingdom does not buy warheads from other countries. Under the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, warheads have to be developed within that very country itself. Thank you.
Jamie Stone.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I make it very clear at this point that neither I nor my party can agree with the proposal to increase the number of nuclear warheads? We also have grave doubts as to some of the spending decisions being made by the government within the context of the defence budget. But can I turn the Secretary of State's attention to something close, I think, to both our hearts? What he has said about the cadet force is welcome. I seek to determine whether the cadet force will be supported in the most outlying parts of the UK, such as Wick and Thurston, my constituency, but more broadly, something I served in myself, the Territorial Army. Could he go a little further on outlining what is going to happen in the future for our volunteer service personnel, the Territorial Army and others right across the UK?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. RF30, which is a report on the next iteration of reserves, will be reporting to Parliament very, very soon, and it will certainly show our desire to build on all the direction of travel with reserves over the years to integrate them further and further into defence. And I think that is incredibly important. The skills they bring and the force multiplier they bring is incredible. And I think within our own department, there has been too much in the past, over the last decade, of resistance to using them properly or involving them, especially in the Army, and we need to do more. On cadets, Madam Deputy Speaker, we have exceeded our target of providing opportunities for 130,000 cadets across the United Kingdom in state secondary schools. We're going to go further in investing in the cadet expansion programme to bring this fantastic opportunity to young people up and down the United Kingdom.
We now go to Gagan Mohindra.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think this government is absolutely right in its vision of a global Britain that does not simply watch from the sidelines, and therefore I welcome today's commitment to a more persistent global engagement. Can my right honourable friend tell the House what this more active approach will actually mean for our gallant armed forces personnel?
Secretary of State.
What it will mean, Madam Speaker, is more opportunity to do their job they've trained for and indeed to help deliver Britain's influence around the world. To be able to go forward, for example, in countries like Somalia or Kenya, to train abroad, provide reassurance and resilience, and indeed to hopefully prevent conflict Preventing conflict is a noble thing. It is not something to be separated. They are not mutually exclusive, because the way we prevent major conflict is indeed sometimes to intervene in support of allies and friends, and that will give young men and women around the country plenty of opportunity around the world, and at the same time they will be able to train as fully as soldiers and follow their specialities.
Video link to Gavin Robinson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And in recognising that the Defence Secretary will come before us in the committee, can I say I look forward to more detailed consideration in due course. But can I also welcome the recognition of the defence procurement footprint within Northern Ireland, and the suggestion that given the cybersecurity and advanced engineering capacity within my own constituency and across the province, the well-placed nature that we are for future investment. But in balancing new technologies with old footprint, can I ask the Secretary of State today to give a commitment for the sustained continuance of the Northern Ireland Garrison, in particular 2 rifles within Lisburn Thiepval Barracks?
Secretary of State.
Yes, I can, to the right honourable gentleman. There will be no change to that. And of course, we continue to invest in Northern Ireland equipment and engineering. Only recently, a £96 million contract we signed with very short-range anti-air missiles in Belfast.
Anthony Higginbottom.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The integrated review last week made clear that the threats that our country faces are changing rapidly, and our adversaries are increasingly operated in the grey zone, where they perceive the risks of repercussions are far lower. Could the Secretary of State therefore confirm that the announcement he's making today will give us the ability to respond to these in a far more meaningful way, because it threatens us and our allies?
Secretary of State.
Yes, one of the ways our adversaries use effectively sub-threshold is by corrupting or undermining a fragile state, by being able to deploy potentially either in support as partner host nations or improve their training. We will help build their resilience, and at the same time we can sometimes supply or co-train on key enabling, like in Kenya, where we do with the Bomb Disposal effectively College, and we help work alongside the Kenyans to train people, and now together we train countries from other parts of Africa.
We now go to Geraint Davis.
Madam Deputy Speaker, our strategic threats are from China, who grows stronger each day from manufacturing trade, and Russia, who are indeed threatened by China, who rely on fossil fuel exports. So instead of just focusing on cutting 1 in 8 soldiers and stockpiling nuclear weapons, what discussions has he had across government about using COP26 to put a carbon tax on trade in order to check Chinese power and to help transition Russia from fossil fuels toward a wood economy for construction in order to tackle climate change, so that holistically we can protect the world without just escalating the risk of war and destruction?
I'm sure the Secretary of State will find a way of answering what was a slightly... Secretary of State.
Madam Speaker, the honourable gentleman actually raises an important point, and at the beginning of the command paper is a chapter about the global trends and the direction. Climate change poses a security threat because it could deliver instability, poverty and problems in other parts of the world that would drive migrant flows and increase friction over precious resource. He is absolutely true. And he is also right, Madam Deputy Speaker, to point out that one of the ways we are going to tackle our security threats is across the whole of government, working together to deal with them. The solution for climate change is obviously going to be, the direction of travel on it at COP26. I can tell you that defence will play its part in both trying to solve its own emissions, but also making sure it provides stability in some of those poorest countries like Sudan, where we recently had people, to make sure that the security threat delivered sometimes by climate change doesn't boil over and threaten more regional stability.
Very good. We now go to Richard Holden.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I welcome the commitment of my right honourable friend to innovation, to the economy, and also in generating the great high-skilled jobs right across the UK, like those at Cook's in Stanhope in County Durham, where we make the tracks for all of Britain's armoured vehicles. I'd really like the Secretary of State to come and visit to see some of the innovative work that they're doing as our tracked vehicles maintain as part of the armed forces for the very significant future.
Secretary of State.
Yes, I'd be delighted to come and visit. You know, we are investing in upgrading our Challengers, and I'd be very keen to come and see and Ajax how they do the engineering.
We now go to Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government has frequently confirmed its commitment to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which it recognises, and I quote, plays an unparalleled role keeping the world safe and containing the nuclear arms race. But this government is now feeding, not ameliorating, nuclear risk. Will the Secretary of State publish the detail in the Attorney General's advice as to why he is seeking to break yet another international agreement, undermining our legal position, and rather than cutting nuclear warheads, as is his obligation, is increasing them by 44%.
Secretary of State.
Madam Speaker, first of all, you will know, having been in this House for many years, that governments do not publish Attorney General's advice. However, what I can say is we do not believe in any way we are breaking the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, and what we really need to do is make sure that we absolutely maintain a credible deterrent.
Video link to Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I thank my right honourable friend for his Defence Command paper, which I broadly welcome, and welcome in particular the integrated review, which looks forward to the modern threats that we face and embraces the capabilities we need to develop to meet those threats. When it comes to the nuclear deterrent, can we remember that this is a bipartisan policy which has been supported by both sides of the House until now, and that we want to maintain that consensus. So can I echo what has been said about the need for discussion and exploration of why we need to increase the cap on the number of warheads, because I'm convinced that we need to maintain a credible deterrent, and I'm sure the government wouldn't be doing this unless there were very strong arguments for doing this to maintain the credibility of the deterrent.
Chief State.
Yes, Madam Deputy Speaker. Obviously, detail around development and use of nuclear warheads and indeed deployment of them is a very sensitive subject. However, I will see what I can do to provide further briefing to honourable members and indeed to specific committees if that is a better way to furnish more detail in a secure environment.
Video link to Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the UK government announces billions more for Trident, while my constituents are being forced to turn to food banks, another poll, this time by BMG Research, has found again that the majority of Scots want independence. Does the Secretary of State really think that prioritising yet more weapons of mass destruction on top of the billions already being spent on it is doing the so-called union any favours when NHS workers and service personnel salaries are either stagnant or being cut?
Secretary of State.
I'm not quite sure, Madam Speaker, whether the Honourable Lady now belongs to a party that does want to belong to NATO or doesn't. If they do want to belong to NATO, which I think is their current position this week, then of course it is a nuclear alliance, and therefore she is tacitly accepting the existence of the defence provided by nuclear weapons. So there's a sort of sleight of hand there, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I think she should also know that despite the polls, the last actual vote on being a member of the United Kingdom, the people who wanted to stay in the United Kingdom in Scotland won, and it wasn't for another generation.
The Chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, Dr. Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Regarding the threats from Russia and Communist China, will my right honourable friend acknowledge that conflict in the grey zone is the modern equivalent to the old Cold War? In both cases, hostile moves were deliberately kept below the threshold for open warfare. So does he accept that those who warn against Cold War containment policies should seriously reflect and reconsider their position?
Secretary of State.
I think my right honourable friend is very right about a lot of these things, that a number of activities take place below the threshold of violence or overt. They are unacceptable. They are carried out by China and Iran and other countries against this country and other countries. And that cannot be, people can't sweep that under the carpet, and we must take action against it. Sometimes we take it in an overt space or through the Foreign Office calling out or attributing certain events like cyber and other things, but also that is why we are taking the capabilities to hand, where we too can reject or repel such actions in the grey zone.
Kevin Jones.
Can I first of all say to the Secretary of State, he should actually read the NAO report of 2010 into the deficit in 2010, because it was said it would be between 6 and 36 billion if you had flat cash. We didn't have that because in 2010 and onwards the defence budget was cut by 16%. But can I ask about the F-35? In the command paper it commits the government to the 48 jets we've already purchased, but no commitments for any further, just an aspiration. The Defence Secretary knows that you need 4 aircraft to provide one operational, so therefore that's at the current rate 12 aircraft available, i.e. 6 on each carrier or 12 on one and none on the other. Now I don't think that will be a great threat to the People's Liberation Army, but could he actually say when the numbers are going to be increased, at what cost? Or is it the case that what we're going to do with our carriers is only be able to deploy them if we do so with the US Marine Corps?
Secretary of State.
Madam Speaker, I have read the NAO report. In fact, I usually bring it to every parliamentary questions because the good thing about it, it shows that in the final year of the Labour government, they spent £3 billion without any idea whatsoever where they were going to get it from. It says it quite clearly in the executive summary. It's also the same government that said the carriers would cost £3 billion and they cost £6 billion. Well, that's a record not to be proud of. We don't recognise, Madam Speaker, the 4-to-1 ratio he's talking about, the F-35s. We will deliver the 48 F-35s to our forces by 2025, and we will continue, as it says in the paper, we will go beyond that number.
Video link to Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the announcement that my right honourable friend intends to grow the UK fleet of frigates and destroyers so that Britannia will once again rule the waves. But can I ask my right honourable friend what impact he expects this to have on the Royal Navy's operational outputs and UK shipbuilding industry, and will those ships be built with good, strong Sheffield steel?
Secretary of State.
First and foremost, the key thing about our ships is to make sure they are available to use. As a Secretary of State Defence, you want them on the seas, able to project power and supporting our allies and friends. And one of the problems in the past, which goes back, Madam Deputy Speaker, to the issue of sort of over-ambition, underfunding, is we had lots on paper, but if you went to Portsmouth, you found them, and you still do, a number of them tied up in sorry state. This command paper will ensure that the new ships and indeed the existing Type 45s and some of the Type 23s will be more available, more deployed and more ready to help Britain. And the new ships, which are going to be made in the Clyde, in Rosyth and indeed the Clyde, part of the United Kingdom, where together collective defence provides jobs for thousands of people and where possible we use as much British parts and equipment as we can do.
Video link to Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a member of the Intelligence and Security Committee, I'm under no illusion about the evolving nature of the security threats that we face. But could I just ask the Secretary of State about the reduction in the number of members of the Army? At the Conservative Party manifesto launch in 2019, the Prime Minister, in a response to the journalist Tom Newton-Dunn, said
when things have failed.
We now go to Dan Jarvis.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Defence Secretary has justified the decision to cut troop numbers because of evolving threats. But there's a hole in that logic. If the threat has changed so much so quickly, what's to say it won't change again? Given the uncertainty, it seems unwise to cut the one thing that above all else gives us our edge, our people. I ask the Secretary of State to think again.
Secretary of State.
The honourable gentleman, I know, comes with good experience of the armed forces. And he will also know the real balance that you have to take, both as a leader and indeed now in this job as the Secretary of State for Defence, between, yes, people are our most important asset, but protecting them is our most important duty. And we have to get that in the right balance. It is no good being over-ambitious with them and deploying them if you cannot support them. Yes, threat can change. Absolutely can change. Could I say in 2035, I wouldn't be in this job, but if somebody was, that they wouldn't come to this House and increase the size of their armed forces? Should that be what is required? They should be able to be free to make that decision, and I would certainly support anyone that did that if they demonstrated what the threat is. But threat goes up, threat evolves, and we have been too slow in the past to follow the threat, because instead we've been following either more shallow or promises that were never kept.
Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that there's been a lot of uninformed hysteria in reaction to the announcement that we are increasing the cap on our number of warheads? If we're going to have a nuclear deterrent, it has to be credible. Now, although I appreciate the sensitivity of the subject, with a number of warheads always having to be serviced, a cap of 180 was not credible in that, especially if we see the debate in context that the French have around 300 warheads, the United States 3,800, and the Russians 6,800, such that more than half the nuclear weapons in the world are Russian at a time when Russia has shown its aggressive intent on other countries.
Secretary of State.
My right honourable friend is absolutely... there's nothing I don't agree with what he has just said. Let's put it in context. We, of the declared nuclear powers, have the lowest stockpile. We need to keep it credible. I fully respect people that do not want a nuclear deterrent or in favour of unilateral disarmament. But if you are not, if you believe a nuclear deterrent has helped keep peace in this country and around Europe for 50 years, then we have to make sure it is credible. To not to do so is to make a laughingstock of the whole thing in the first place.
Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm anxious to allow the Secretary of State a chance to expand on that. What exactly is the new threat or change to the strategic environment it is that the government considers requires a stockpile of 260 warheads rather than 180 in order to offer that minimum credible deterrent that was presumably offered before? And how can that 45% increase in the number of warheads be reconciled in any way with a sincere, meaningful commitment to arms control, disarmament and this country's obligations to nuclear non-proliferation?
State.
You achieve disarmament when two sides are both credible with what they're offering up. To offer up something that wouldn't be credible would mean you'd get taken to the cleaners and the other people would just carry on, especially with the completely unbalanced numbers of warheads around the world.
Video link to Adam Holloway.
Madam Deputy Speaker, firstly, can I congratulate the Secretary of State and his team on these forward-thinking and rather smart proposals? Does he agree with me that the opposition parties need to understand the reality of modern warfare, which is a shift towards the grey zone and high tech, where you can have thousands of tanks, but they're no use to you if the moment you deploy on the battlefield, your enemy destroys them? So perhaps the Secretary of State could arrange a briefing for the opposition parties on what happened to all those tanks in Syria, or what all those Armenian conscripts suffered from a modernised Azeri military, because they really don't seem to understand.
State.
My honourable friend makes an important point, and I made available to members of the House a briefing by the Chief of Defence Intelligence last week, where he set out the range of emerging threats, all the way from Russian ballistic missile defence to the proliferation of technology into the hands of often non-state militias. And that is one of the big challenges of today that our conventional forces need to grapple with. No longer is it necessarily tank on tank, it is potentially Syrian fighters using pickups but firing a top generation of anti-tank missile. That is a game changer. We have to be able to deal with it. If we do deploy armour, we have to better protect it, or we have to find other ways with dealing it. It has been blatantly clear in the last 12 months in Libya, in Syria, in the Caucasus, that you are incredibly exposed on the battlefield if you can be found, even by some of the most low-tech weapon systems.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The confirmation of a reduction in troop numbers will obviously be a huge concern to many service personnel, including those based at Lookers in my constituency. Now, I was working for Career Transition Partnership at their Scottish Resettlement Centre during the last round of redundancies linked to the strategic review. So can I ask the Secretary of State what engagement has he had with CTP over the impact of the changes announced today on resettlement services? And will he commit to ensure that all service leavers get full support in the resettlement journey?
State.
All service leaders will get full support in the settlement journey, but there are going to be no redundancies of service personnel related to these reductions.
Number 24 is withdrawn, so we go to Derek Twigg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say to the Secretary of State, he knows the Defence Committee has been briefed on the emerging threats and the change in technology over the last year or two on the battlefield. But he seems to be arguing that in order to modernise the armed forces, it's okay to reduce the numbers in it. And I would argue that actually we can have an increased armed force size and the new technology and the modernisation he's talked about. So can I ask him a specific question? Our special forces, as we know, are world class. In a reduced army, how is he going to maintain the calibre and quality of recruits to the special forces?
Secretary of State.
Well, first and foremost, when it comes to numbers, carriers used to take 1,800 members to crew it. Now they take 800. That is simply the direction of travel with automation and modern equipment. Tanks and armoured vehicles often now have less crews than they used to. That is a fact. That is just the way some of the equipment has developed. And therefore, of course, it is logical to understand that sometimes you need less people to achieve the same lethality, or even sometimes less people to achieve even more lethality. A battalion of the First World War is a very different battalion of today. And that is blatantly obvious to anyone who looks at defence capabilities. When it comes to special forces, two things I think will help in the recruitment of special forces: the development of a Ranger battalion and the future commando force, where we are going to increase the spending and training and equipment available to them, the basic training being around the areas that you might have seen the special forces doing 10, 15, 20 years ago, will be a great sounding for it. And also we see that the reserve special forces regiments are becoming a very good recruiter for the regulars as well.
Mark Francois.
Thank you. The Defence Select Committee's very unsentimental report into army procurement recently concluded. This report reveals a woeful story of bureaucratic procrastination, military indecision, financial mismanagement and general ineptitude, which have continually bedevilled attempts to properly re-equip the British Army over the last 2 decades. Secretary of State's statement didn't mention the 400 million that's just been wasted by the cancellation of the Warrior upgrade. Taken with the Tracer programme and the FRES programme in here, that's nearly £750 million of British taxpayers' money wasted by the department for nothing. When will the Defence Secretary finally accept that procurement is the Achilles heel of the MOD? And whilst I wouldn't agree with Labour the whole department should be put in special measures, defence and equipment and support undoubtedly should, because it's a basket case, and until you solve it, the rest of the review is a waste of time.
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I read that report. I think of reports I've read in my time. Well, I think I'll give it 1 out of 10, Madam Deputy Speaker. First of all, 4 members of that committee accumulated over a decade in the department that bought the armoured vehicles. No sense whatsoever about the irony of the criticism I've just heard from my right honourable friend. None at all. Of course, since I got in the department, the first thing I did was I committed to signing up Boxer, which hadn't been done, had sat on the shelf for a bit. I made sure we developed Box, signed it up, got it delivered, and it's going to be made in the United Kingdom in a partnership between BAE and Rheinmetall. I took decisions. He may not like the decisions about the Warrior upgrade programme. It had been, like he knows, wandering around for many years, including the years he was in the department, Madam Deputy Speaker. Tracer, if you will remember, as far back as I do, Tracer was cancelled by the United States, of which we had been a partner in the mid-90s. Frez, if you remember, and I'm sure he does, but it doesn't seem to appear in the report, was affected by the changes to the attacks on personnel by proliferation of basic anti-armour capability into the hands of the likes of the Taliban, and that is why Frez had to be up-armoured, changed in size, changed in scale. The threat changed. He might not have liked the consequence, but would I have rather, and I wasn't in that department, and I'm sure that would be his defence when he was in the department, would he have rather progressed with an inadequate vehicle where soldiers got killed, or took the decision to potentially cancel it and move on? The Boxer... Well, in the Boxer, the thing is...
We can't... I think yelling at each other is really not a good look. I think the Secretary of State has come to the end of his... we now go to Barry Shearman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I bring a little bit of peace to the Chamber by suggesting that what we all need is some stability in the Defence Department. I think the Secretary of State is the 6th Secretary of State since 2010. I come from an army background. My father and 2 brothers served in the British Army. I represent Huddersfield, where David and Brown Gears and other major defence manufacturers exist. But is the Minister aware that we want it all? We want the modern technology. I've always believed that we need an independent nuclear force. But thirdly, what I have consistently said to his predecessors since 2010, all of the other things we want, but at the end of the day, the Russians and the Chinese today will look at us going down to 72,000 men and women in our armed services, and they'll think we've run up the white flag. What's he going to say about that?
Secretary of State.
I think, first of all, the Russians, Madam Speaker, will look at the fact that we have learned the lessons of Crimea and others, and we will be investing in deep fires, which was a place that we were deeply vulnerable to. They hadn't been upgraded, which has allowed the Russians to have a strategic edge. They will look at the fact we're starting to invest in ballistic missile defence capabilities, anti-missile capabilities that we have been missing for many, many years, and that is why our adversaries went there. They will look at the fact we're going to invest in a multi-role surveillance vessel so we can protect our critical infrastructure, because the Russians worked out we hadn't invested there and gone to protect them there. So what they will see is that we have seen what they are up to, and we are going to do something about it. And what they will also see is the area they seem to have got away with most, the sub-threshold, the grey zone, where they have inflicted cyber, corruption, all sorts of espionage from some of our adversaries onto this country and her allies and our citizens, is where we too are going to be there to compete back against them.
Now, we do have another 12 questions to get through, and we've run rather over time already. So I would urge briefness. James Sunderland.
Madam Deputy Speaker, while I am concerned about cuts to my own service and possible stretch, I do recognise that this is an excellent bit of work, and I commend my right honourable friend for the intellectual rigour that's gone into this modern and innovative paper. Given our increasing focus on expeditionary capabilities and our allies, notably in the Pacific, does my right honourable friend see any change to how we might operate east of Suez?
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend makes a really important point about the importance of how we operate in making sure we not only defend ourselves but project our influence. Being present is half the battle. Our adversaries know that, and we, for often too long, have remained here in the homeland and not necessarily been present. And as a former Royal Logistic Corps officer, he will also know the key importance of enablers The days when enablers were in the background and didn't get the audience or the importance that they deserved are over. Many countries around the world who might not want infantry or tanks to help them often want signallers or enablers or logistics, and they are just as important in projecting Britain's forces and Britain's power projection around the world to make sure that the brand of Britain stays true to its values and helps people around the world.
Video link to Richard Bergen.
At a time when the government says there's no money for a proper pay rise for NHS workers, it's going to give the military the biggest financial boost since the Cold War, and is going to waste billions more, increasing the number of UK nuclear weapons by 40%. Each UK nuclear warhead has an explosive power 8 times that of a nuclear bomb barbarically dropped on Hiroshima at the end of the Second World War that killed over 140,000 civilians. If we're going to spend billions more increasing the number of nuclear weapons, then what's to stop others also doing the same in a new global arms race?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we're not going to spend billions increasing the number of nuclear weapons. This House voted in 2016, and I'm sure he didn't, and certainly the leader he used to follow didn't vote for it, but the House collectively voted for a nuclear deterrent. That's what it believes. I think the number of people who don't believe it are probably joining him in the room where he's asking the question.
Preston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to congratulate and thank my right honourable friend for his statement. Now, the review specifically refers to a more productive integration of the reserve forces. Can I ask my honourable friend to give a bit more detail on that? And will he confirm that the reserves have to remain a vital part of our whole force structure?
Secretary of State.
Look, my honourable friend is absolutely right. Look, they are really important. They're more important than they have ever been. And when I look across the 3 services, different services embrace them well. Some could do a lot more to do so. I've already started the process of trying to remove barriers to make sure that the attitudes within the department about using reserves not as a last resort but as an integral part of what we wish to do. RF30 will report soon, and no doubt he will be interested in the results. But what we saw in COVID and what we have seen across the services is a willingness, a seamlessness between reserves and regulars, and I think we need to embrace that even more to make sure that the men and women who want to contribute to this country's defence, no matter who they are, can do so and bring those skills to bear.
Video link, Carol Moynihan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to hear a little more about how the reduction in troop numbers is going to be managed. Can the Secretary of State confirm that there will be no redundancies? And also in the past, a shortage of personnel has meant an increased workload for those others that remain. So how will he ensure that personnel are able to maintain a good work-life balance if they're having to carry out the work of more people?
Secretary of State.
Look, first of all, there will not be any redundancies from this. This can be managed over the next 5 years by reducing either inflow or by reducing inflow when you come to recruit. Secondly, to make sure people aren't overburdened, we're going to apply intelligent recruiting, which will allow people greater choice when they arrive at the recruit centres or indeed at training to make sure that units that are undermanned are properly in receipt of enough people to do so.
Yes. Mark Pritchard.
Can I welcome this thoughtful Defence Command paper, and in particular the new investment in space, in cyber, autonomous vehicles, defence intelligence and defence science. But isn't it the case there is still a need for metal on the ground? And can I welcome the new investment in the Boxer vehicle programme and the Challenger 3 programme, very welcome throughout the West Midlands. But can the Secretary of State tell the House what that will mean for Shropshire in particular? And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, can I put an early bid in for the new Special Operations Brigade to come and reside in Shropshire, near to Hereford SAS, near to the Welsh Training Mountains? Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, there's the first bid, Madam Deputy Speaker, for his Rangers and for his constituency. My right honourable friend is a doughty fighter for his constituents. He has consistently worked towards asking me to make sure that vehicles like Boxer and the Challenger upgrade happen. I am delighted that to say to him today that they, first of all, Boxer is coming, and I've asked for it to be accelerated in its delivery to make sure our army get it, but also, in addition, that the Challenger will be upgraded, which is good news for his work and his constituency.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I see that units of government press officers have been on manoeuvres this past week, but unfortunately they've been spinning on cuts to our army. Now, the regular army will have shrunk from 113,000 to 72,000 under Conservative government since 2010. So why doesn't the Secretary of State accept that reducing the size of our forces makes us less agile and less secure as a country?
No, I don't think it does, and when his party was in government, they didn't reverse the reductions from the time I was in the army. The key is to get in balance, giving, as I've said throughout this afternoon, giving our soldiers and sailors the right protection they need, making sure that our ambition doesn't overstretch them, and indeed making sure they have the right training and investment into themselves, so they not only stay, but they also have a fulfilled career.
Andrew Barry.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. I very much welcome the words by my right honourable friend in the dispatch box this afternoon, especially his commitment to over 20 frigates and destroyers by the end of the next decade. But I was slightly concerned by the vague reference to the new automatic mine hunting system which will replace the Sandown and Hunt classes. My right honourable friend knows that these two classes do far more than just hunt mines. They are a great deterrent and deliver a presence in supporting our allies around the world. So might he give more detail on what this new automatic mine hunting capability is and whether the Sandown and Hunt classes will be replaced like for like?
First of all, I'm delighted. I will, if you'd like to, get him a briefing on exactly the progress of that. What is the case is that automated mine hunting at the moment can cover in key points far more area than a ship, and it is really important for some parts of the patrols and areas that we do. But I'm delighted to give him more detail. I'll get him a briefing for him.
Video link to Emma Lewell-Buck.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last week, the Prime Minister was unable to state how the government's commitment to international law fitted with breaching Article 6 of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Defence Secretary has since said that the raising of the cap on the nuclear warhead stockpile is to ensure the UK has a credible nuclear deterrent in response to Russia and others. And he said that we will still have one of the lowest stockpiles. So can the Secretary of State explain exactly how long our deterrent hasn't been credible, and how does this increase below others make it now credible?
State.
No, I'm afraid I can't at the dispatch box tell people about the credibility in detail of our nuclear deterrent, because to do so would undermine the security. However, what I can assure the Honourable Lady is that we keep it under review, and as we announced last week, it was important to increase the warheads, which still makes us the lowest of the declared nuclear powers, in stockpile, to make sure it remains credible.
Video link to James Gray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The detail of the announcement, wide-ranging report it is, will be chewed over the coming days, and there'll be some good bits and some bad bits. But can I congratulate the Secretary of State both on the honesty and the directness and the detail that he's got in this command paper. Really is very refreshing indeed. I very much welcome the concentration in the integrated review on climate change. And he will know very well that the worrying rate of retreating the ice in the Arctic has commercial opportunities as well as threats. Yet at the same time, the Russians have increased their submarine and above surface capabilities in the Arctic very, very considerably in recent years. So what does the Secretary of State intend to do with regard to safeguarding our commercial vehicles, which may well be making use of the Northern Sea Route in years to come?
State.
My right honourable friend is absolutely right to point out the challenges around the High North and the opportunities around the High North, and indeed the growing activities of the Russian Navy from the Northern Fleet. That's why we think one of the best ways to secure the commercial traffic is be more present, and recently we sent ships into the Barents Sea for the first time since the Cold War. We will continue to do so. We always work with our allies up there, whether that's Norway or United States or even France on some of these issues. That's why it's part of NATO's home beat. And it's one of the reasons it's important to make sure we have a viable but also available fleet to always respond to the different threats as they emerge.
Tanmanjeet Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our brave and highly trained military servicemen and women are, as the Defence Secretary himself stated a short while ago, our finest defence asset. But while talking tough on defence, the Conservative government has eroded their morale and strength by cutting over 45,000 personnel during this decade of decline, made worse still by today's manifesto-breaking commitment to reduce the army size to a mere 72,500, to the extent that our smaller army is now a cause for serious concern for our global allies. So does the Secretary of State agree with the Chief of Defence Staff that the ability to field a war-fighting division is the standard by which the UK Army will be judged as credible by its allies?
First of all, yes, and we can. And secondly, if he really wants to know what's morale sapping, it's something I experienced under his government, and indeed the government I was, also the Conservative government, sitting in the back of something that's unprotected and vulnerable to the people that want to kill you.
Shelbrooke.
Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I very much welcome this defence review, and it's a proper look at the threats as they evolve and what's moving forward, and that's a welcome change what's gone in the past. But we must also recognise that Article 42 of the Lisbon Treaty, PESCO, puts at real risk the NATO alliance, and especially as we've seen in the last weeks, the unreliability of the EU in the commitments it makes. So can I ask my right honourable friend, in terms of our naval presence, which is going to be so important in our trade routes and protection of our data cables, does he have the capability, after this review, to react quickly and upgrade our naval capability if, sadly, allies who we think we can rely on, we can't?
Well, first of all, my honourable friend makes an important point. NATO, first and foremost, is the guarantor of European security. No other organisation is, and we don't forget that. We, of course, sit round at NATO defence ministers and foreign ministers and discuss with all of those partners. There is a proper process of verifying and holding to account our commitments, and that is why the National Readiness Initiative, the NRI, that predominantly the United States kicks off a few years ago, was all about making sure we were ready and able. It is a constant process of being validated and making sure you can deliver what you are supposed to do. And NATO publishes its annual reports and does indeed hold us to account. We're confident we can do that, but also as the second biggest spender in NATO and with a large group of forces, despite the narrative that are being put out from opposite, we are capable of doing concurrent operations and other types of operations if needed.
Video link, Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. According to Admiral Mike Mullen, the ex-chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, 70,000 odd armed forces is about the same size as the entire US Special Forces. And to quote him, he said, the UK forces will be getting pretty small. Now, I know, Madam Deputy Speaker, that our forces are very special, but given the absence of the member, Right Honourable Member for Beckenham, perhaps his absence is explained by these announcements. But his learnings, surely, and I'm sure that of the Secretary of State, were that we need boots on the ground if we are ever to win the peace. They were surely the lessons of Sierra Leone, Bosnia, Iraq, and Afghanistan. How on earth are we going to achieve that in future?
Secretary of State.
The lessons of Sierra Leone and other places is actually, if you engage in conflict prevention early enough and you build out capacity of a country to resist insurgencies and subversion, you actually avoid having a war in conflict in the first place. And the lessons of Iraq is, yes, you can put lots of troops on the ground, but once you've defeated the Iraqi army, if you then don't have an alternative to start building that state again, you have people sitting around in tanks and armoured vehicles after the conflict where they are absolutely attacked on a daily basis, and they're the wrong people in the wrong place. I think that's why I heard what the United States senior and respected Admiral said today. He also said if General Sir Nick Carter, the Chief of Defence Staff, who he knows well, is in support of this, then so is he.
Last question, Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do welcome the announcements of today, especially the formation of the Ranger Regiment. Now, I see the Secretary of State has set himself up for a win by recruiting these from 4 rifles, which came from the legendary 2nd Battalion, the Royal Green Jackets, my own regiment. when does the Secretary of State think that they'll be fully formed and operational for deployment?
Well, first of all, I think we've got a volunteer here, Madam Deputy Speaker, and if he's ready to deploy, I've got somewhere I could send him next week. I have asked the Chief of the General Staff to make sure that the initial funding we have for the starting and the equipping is delivered, or it's started to be rolled out to at least one regiment. We obviously have to start to train them up. It's a new discipline. It's in addition to what they've already done, and that will obviously take time to establish. But I'm keen, like him, to get on it as soon as possible, and then maybe he can deploy as potentially their honorary colonel or something, Madam.
I thank the Secretary of State for his statement. And point of order, Nasrat Ghani.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I did give prior notice. This week, my BAE Select Committee published a report on supply chains linked back to Xinjiang. And Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to raise a point of order to gauge your advice and judgment on the situation I now find myself in when officials from the Chinese Embassy in London are accusing members of Parliament, the committee, and I therefore believe the House of lies. I've been bombarded with tweets claiming that some politicians choose to believe the lies made up by a few. They choose to dance with anti-China elements in their clumsy dramas. Such things such as frivolous and preposterous farces aimed to discredit and smear China will only end up undercutting their own reputation as a laughing stock, and goes on about consciousness and facing the reckoning of justice. Madam Deputy Speaker, I need you to provide me with some guidance if this goes against the grain of allowing MPs to conduct their work without fear, and whether accusing a Select Committee report of being full of lies is also contempt of Parliament. Colleagues have noted to me that the language used publicly that I've been subjected to could be considered as threatening, but I seek your guidance. I hope that you agree with me. We should not allow foreign interference to challenge the House or a Select Committee or any MP for doing what they've been elected to do.
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for giving notice that she wished to raise this point of order. It is clearly unacceptable that members of committees of this House should feel in any way threatened as a result of the views they express, and any kind of intimidatory behaviour directed at members of a committee is wrong, and this House should take it very seriously. In this case, I note that the official concerned has stated that he is not seeking to be threatening. However, if the Honourable Lady feels that the issue is not resolved, I would encourage her to pursue the issue with the House authorities. Thank you. Point of order, Ian Paisley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and again I give notice that I would ask this point of order. I understand that the Northern Ireland Secretary will lay matters before this House to take upon himself powers to direct the Northern Ireland Department of Health and indeed the Assembly on the devolved and controversial matter of abortion. This will have grave implications for the NDNA, this agreement, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the devolution settlement. It would be unprecedented for a London department to direct a Northern Ireland devolved department. Has the Secretary of State indicated to the Chair that he intends to make a statement on this? How can we scrutinise this properly and hold this government to account?
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for giving notice of his point of order. I can't speak for the business managers, and I'm not aware of notification of a statement, but I'm sure the government front bench will have heard what he has said about the desirability of notice for debate on such matters. Thank you. I'll now, point of order, Dr. Julian Lewis.
Further to the point of order raised by my honourable friend for Wealdon, I don't think that it's a case of whether one feels intimidated. Surely it's a case of somebody attached to a foreign embassy sending an electronic message directly to the Twitter account of a parliamentarian that would make anybody feel intimidated. And I do hope that you and Mr. Speaker will consider whether or not some representations can be made about conduct or misconduct of this sort.
Well, as I think I made clear, It is extremely important that members and of committees or members of Parliament in general do not feel threatened. And as I say, I would suggest that any further representations should be made to the House authorities if there is a feeling that this is anyway continuing or hasn't been resolved in a satisfactory manner. Thank you. I'll now suspend the House for 3 minutes to make arrangements for the next business. Order, order. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Trade Bill, consideration of Lord's message.
Now. I must draw the House's attention to the fact that financial privilege is engaged by Lord's Amendment 3E. If any Lord's Amendment engaging financial privilege is agreed to, I will cause the customary entry waiving Commons financial privilege to be entered in the journal. We begin with the Government's motion to insist on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D and disagree with Lord's Amendment E. I call Minister Greg Hands.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So I beg to move that this House insists on its Amendments 3C and 3D and disagrees to Lord's Amendment 3E. But let me start off, Madam Deputy Speaker. I heard my honourable friend, the member for Wealdon, and the apparent targeting of her by anybody in an intimidatory way, including foreign embassies, is totally unacceptable. and I will pass her comments directly to the Foreign Secretary. The government takes very seriously indeed the intimidation of members of Parliament, as indeed do House authorities. I remember about 10 years ago in a meeting actually with Lord Alton and the North Korean speaker, and I was shoved by a North Korean diplomat, and it was taken up very seriously by this House and by the Foreign Office at the time as well. But let me begin, Madam Deputy Speaker, by saying that the government agrees with the principle that our proposed free trade agreement should be subject to the most searching parliamentary scrutiny in any instance where genocide may be occurring. The amendment passed by this House on February the 9th, in the name of my honourable friend, the member for Bromley and Chislehurst, delivers on that principle, and that is why the government continues to support it today. This amendment ensures that the government must put its position on record in writing in response to a select committee publication raising credible reports of genocide in a country with which we are proposing a bilateral free trade agreement. Where the committee is not content with the response, it can insist on a parliamentary debate, and the government will be obliged to make time for this. The amendment also affords the responsible Common Select Committee the responsibility to draft the motion for debate. And that is a very powerful ability, Madam Deputy Speaker, for Parliament to stop any free trade agreement negotiations. This is a substantial concession, affording Parliament significant control over the process, and it has the government's full support. On timing and effectiveness, to be very clear, the government expects that its production of a report and the scheduling of any subsequent debate would be undertaken swiftly and within agreed timescales. I will note that in the amendment passed by the Lords, tabled by Lord Alton, peers have removed the role that they had previously proposed for the High Court. Honourable members will recall that it is the government's long-standing position that the determination of genocide is a matter for a competent court. As I've previously made clear, competent courts include relevant international courts and domestic criminal courts. Let me be clear on this point. We are not changing settled government policy here. But likewise, in supporting the amendment from the Chair of the Justice Select Committee, we are not asking Parliament to make a determination on whether genocide has occurred. We are instead supporting a process that guarantees scrutiny and debate where Parliament has established for itself that credible reports of genocide exist. This is not the same as a judicial finding, nor is it intended to be. It is both a lower bar and swifter to establish credible reports than it is to prove genocide itself. And this leads to a debate on a substantive motion. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe this is the right way forward. This brings me to the latest amendment passed by a former Liberal MP, Lord Alton, in the other place, which seeks to give a quasi-judicial role to an ad hoc parliamentary judicial committee to make preliminary determinations of genocide. Lord Alton proposes this ad hoc committee would comprise 5 members from either House, where those members have all held, and I quote from the amendment, high judicial office. Now, it should be clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this approach is problematic. First, because it is in conflict with the government's settled policy. Competent courts must make determinations on genocide, not parliamentary committees. Of course.
I don't pretend to expertise on this particular controversy, but I do recall that when it was last debated, one of the objections being made was the fact that if an outside court were to make the determination, that would be taking power away from this Parliament. Now the government seems to be objecting to parliamentarians making this determination, even though they are highly qualified by dint of being former judges. That seems to me a little bit cake and eat it situation.
Thank you, and I thank my right honourable friend for that intervention, because there is clearly areas of possible confusion in this space. So let me be absolutely clear. The objection from the government was the High Court determining that there be a debate in Parliament. That is the crucial difference between the previous Alton Amendment and our objections to this one. It isn't about where genocide is determined. It is about whether the court dictates the proceedings of Parliament. So Lord Alton proposes that the High Judicial Office. It should be clear that this approach is problematic. First, because it is in conflict with the government's settled policy. As I've said, giving such a power to an ad hoc parliamentary judicial committee would represent a fundamental constitutional reform. It would blur the distinction between courts and parliament and upset the separation of powers, and so the government cannot support it. Honourable members should also note that... yes, I will. Yeah.
I'm very grateful for my honourable friend and for his comments earlier on. I'm slightly anxious that my right honourable friend may be misrepresenting a situation at the dispatch box. Unintentionally. Unintentionally. Forgive me. The quasi-judicial has a meaning in law. What the Alton Amendment proposes is that members of the House of Lords who were previously judges are able to review any decision that the House of Commons Select Committee makes. It is not a court. It is just a select committee in the House of Lords. What has my minister got to fear?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that intervention. But it is clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the definition in the amendment of those who have held high judicial office will, in the view of the government, inevitably confer quasi-judicial status on that committee. By definition, it is 5 members who have held high judicial office. It would be very difficult not to have the impression that that is operating in a quasi-judicial manner. I'm going to make a little bit more progress. It's very limited time. I'm going to make a bit more progress. So let me deal with this matter of engaging financial privilege. When an amendment is designated as engaging Commons financial privilege, the government is procedurally required to provide this as the reason if disagreeing to the motion, although our reasons for disagreeing are much broader, as I've just set out. Financial privilege is sufficient reason in itself to deem the amendment disagreed to. The designation of Lord's amendments as engaging financial privilege is an impartial process determined by the Speaker on the advice of House authorities. We have listened closely to debates, Madam Deputy Speaker, in both this House and the other place, and we take very seriously the issue of genocide and the passions it has rightly stirred on all sides. Consequently, Madam Deputy Speaker, I can announce from this dispatch box today that the government is willing to work with Parliament and relevant select committee chairs should they choose to establish new joint committees or subcommittees, or to engage the expertise of former members of the judiciary in considering reports of genocide in the context of our proposed free trade agreements. For example, the membership of a new joint committee could be made up of members of both select committees. The relevant Lords Committee would have crossbench membership, and it would be possible for the convener to ensure that at least one of these members were an ex-judge. This is the established process that is followed for other committees, which have been chaired by ex-law lords. In addition, with the agreement of the usual channels, it would be possible for additional members with relevant expertise to be appointed to the Joint Committee, as is the case with the Lords Subcommittee on the Northern Ireland Protocol. The Joint Committee would also be able to take evidence from other former members of the judiciary if desired. I'm going to make more progress. In any case, it is not necessary to set this out in legislation. And in fact, I would be surprised if honourable members voted today to bind themselves in this way, setting out the procedures of a parliamentary subcommittee in legislation. Parliament is free to amend its standing orders to set up committees and subcommittees as it chooses, and to take evidence from those with legal expertise if it deems this to be necessary. Legislating for these matters would only serve to remove flexibility from both Parliament and government should the issue of genocide, as it pertains to trade, arise in future. A more nimble and flexible approach may be necessary depending on the context. The precise details remain to be worked out by Parliament quite properly, Madam Deputy Speaker, but I hope it will be clear from what I have said today that the government is supportive of working with honourable members on this issue and is committed to doing so in line with the process previously agreed to by this House on the 9th of February. But we regret, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's a very limited time in this debate. We cannot support the creation of a parliamentary judicial committee as envisaged in Lord Alton's amendment, as it blurs the distinction between legislative and judicial and runs contrary to government policy, that it is for competent courts to make determinations of genocide. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'd like to highlight the statement made by my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, made on sanctions that the government will be undertaking earlier today. I hope that this is another illustration of the government's commitment in this very important area, taking tough action on China in Xinjiang with Magnitsky sanctions taken in conjunction with our international allies. In light of what I've said today, I hope that honourable members will support Amendments 3C and 3D.
First of all, to inform the House that the Speaker has selected the amendment in the name of Nusrat Ghani. The question is that this House insists on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D and disagrees with the Lords in their Amendment E. Before I call the Shadow Secretary of State, just to inform the House as well that there will be a 3-minute limit on speeches for backbenchers. There is the countdown clock for those in the chamber, and for those participating virtually, it will be on the screens. Shadow Secretary of State Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. By my calculations, it's been 3 years, 2 months and 2 weeks since this House first debated the government's proposed trade bill. So if today's debate proves to be the final one in a long, drawn-out bill, then it does seem an appropriate time to thank all members of both houses, all the parliamentary clerks and all the officials in the Department for International Trade who have contributed to its passage. Madam Deputy Speaker, looking back at the very first day of the debate in January 2018, I was struck by two things that were said by the Right Honourable Member for North Somerset, the then Secretary of State, which seemed very prescient in retrospect. The first was, and I quote, "Trade is an issue that transcends party politics." And time and again over the past 3 years, we have seen that to be the case, as members from all sides of the House have campaigned together on different issues from farming standards to online harms. It seems fitting, after more than 3 years, that we should have been left with one final issue to resolve. And that is that where cross-party consensus about where we stand for as a parliament and what we believe in as a country will be the most important of all. And it relates to the second thing that the former Secretary of State said 3 years ago, which I believe is equally relevant today. He said, and I quote, "Trade is not only about self-interested commercial gain." For me, that simple statement of principle goes to the heart of the debate that we have had in recent months, and especially in the last week, in relation to human rights and trade. I think that it goes to the heart of the decision that we have to take today in relation to the Alton Amendment, to the Genocide Amendment. And I know that there are some people, Madam Deputy Speaker, who believe that the choices that we make as a country on who to sign trade deals with should be entirely dictated by our commercial interests, and that considerations about human rights should be dealt with entirely separately. But there is another point of view, Madam Deputy Speaker, which I believe is shared by the majority of people in this country and by the majority of MPs in this House, which is simply this: that there is a line that needs to be drawn, that there are certain countries whose crimes are so great that they cannot simply be ignored on the basis of commercial self-interest, and that Britain as a country must be willing to say no to trade deals with countries that cross that line. The Alton Amendment, as advanced today by the member for Wealdon, seeks to draw that line by giving Parliament the power to debate whether Britain should sign any form of bilateral trade or investment deal with a government held responsible for genocide by our country's most experienced judges. And whether members in this House decide to support that amendment today should have nothing to do with what party they represent. It should have nothing to do with the long overdue sanctions against Chinese officials announced by the Foreign Secretary earlier today. And with all due respect to the Minister of State, it should have nothing to do with the points of constitutional precedence that he made in his opening speech. Whether we support the Alton Amendment should only come down to the fundamental question, which is one that we need to all ask ourselves. Should Britain be willing to sign trade agreements with governments who are committing genocide? Should Britain be willing to sign trade deals with governments which are engaging in torture, mass detention, slave labour, organ harvesting, and non-judicial executions, not on an isolated basis but on an industrial scale, against the Uyghur population in Xinjiang? Should Britain be willing to sign trade deals with a government which is separating hundreds of thousands of children from their parents and re-educating them in different languages, religion and history in an attempt to wipe the Uyghur culture off the Chinese map? And should Britain be willing to sign trade deals with a government that is carrying out the systematic sexual abuse, rape and sterilisation of hundreds of thousands of women in Xinjiang in an attempt to guarantee that this current generation of Uyghur children is the last? I cannot see how anyone in this House can read the evidence of those crimes which are being committed against the Uyghurs and think that a potential trade or investment deal with China can be considered only on its commercial merits and not on the basis of morality. That is surely where we need to draw the line, and that is what the Alton Amendment seeks to do, and that is why I urge members on all sides of this House to look into their souls this afternoon, to vote with their conscience, and to make clear that this is the line that Britain is not prepared to cross.
I think she's finished.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were giving way.
No, I've sat down. I've finished.
Sorry, I hadn't seen your
Jordan. Otherwise, I would have.
Sir Ian Duncan-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to continue the debate that has been going on amongst us about what actually constitutes a fair and reasonable settlement with the government. Now, I simply say that, first of all, I want to start by moving the amendment standing in my honourable friends from Wildon's name and that of myself and my honourable friend for East Worthing and Shoreham. And I do that because I think that the government's got itself twisted up in knots on this, I have to tell him, and I think he knows that. He knows very well that when this amendment was first put through the Lords, I spoke to a number of ministers, and I must say, reaction from each of the ministers was, don't think there's a problem here. You've met our red lines, and this is a committee in the Lords. Suddenly, late in the day, they discovered this phenomenal red line called quasi-judicial. Can I just say, on the definition the government has given us today, quasi-judicial can be applied to any select committee in the House of Commons. It can be applied to any committee. Here is what a quasi-judicial committee, in legal terms, is defined as. Let me just give it to him. Its definition of quasi-judicial is a proceeding conducted by an administrative or executive official. Now, this is important because Parliament does not have any of those on its committees. And this is the important point. Parliament is separate from the executive, so it does not apply to Parliament. The second thing, he knows very well, by the way, that we have allowed in this amendment the government to set the terms of how that will sit, the balance of evidence, and the kind of peers that would sit in there, which is to do with the judiciary. Does my honourable want to give?
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and does he agree with me that it's very difficult to see a position that the minister would actually agree to, and yet in the Lords they have changed and tried to compromise so often. And does he agree with me that under the terms of the government's own amendment to this bill, the Uyghurs do not come under the remit and therefore would have no protection from this House?
Yeah, I'm grateful. My honourable friend knows very well that the problem is this amendment from the Lords incorporates the Neil Amendment, the original Neil Amendment. It incorporates it in its entirety. It makes two adjustments. And this is really on paragraphs 2A, where it's quite clear two things happen as a result of that. Number one, there are already trade arrangements with China, but they're pushed aside in this. It can only be an FTA, and it's a prospective one. And that means that the Uyghurs are not going to get in front of the Select Committee at all. The second thing, which is very important, is it also opens the door, because of the definition, to any state activist who has nothing to do with the authority in that state. Those are the two things. All QCs have seen this straight away and accepted this is a major problem. So we've dealt with that, made it a better arrangement, and added the committee. The second thing, added the legal committee. And the second point about this is, it seems to me that the government simply doesn't want to have these judges involved. And then they go to the other twist, which is, well, we'll have a judge if you want on one of the select committees. Well, what does that do? Doesn't that make it now apparently another quasi-judicial opening? The truth is, it's really, if he doesn't mind me saying so, a bit sad that the government couldn't have accepted this amendment. There was no need for us to be here today voting on this. This was a major compromise, and it would have settled everything. And therefore I say to my right honourable friend, who he knows I have huge respect for him in the job that he has to do right now, but I simply say we had a chance and have a chance tonight to send a message following a very good statement by the Foreign Secretary that we simply won't put up with this. We're not frightened of finding that this is genocide, and we're not frightened of saying it from the steepletops. We know that what we have to do is stand up for those who have no voice. This chamber has a history of doing that. It has an opportunity tonight to do that, and I'm sorry that my government, I hugely respect, doesn't think that they can do it. I urge people to vote tonight for this particular Lord's Amendment.
We now go to the SNP spokesperson, Drew Hendry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As an aside, I noticed the countdown timer is running on this. I assume I get the front bench privilege for this speech.
The Honourable Gentleman certainly does. Sorry, it would be a mistake if the countdown was running. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, the original intent of the Lord's Amendment on genocide for this bill was to bind the government. It was to bind the government to ensure that its trade policy was not actively engaging in propping up the economy of a country that was committing genocide. This is something that these benches regarded as being reflective of the bare minimum standards of what should be our commitments to human rights and to global citizenship. Madam Deputy Speaker, I say bare minimum because there should be much more power given to that commitment than was contained even in that amendment. What we should see is an approach along the lines of a comprehensive cross-departmental strategy aimed at preventing atrocities and binding both the behaviour and intent of government action to such commitments. The original amendment from Lord Alton was in itself a bit hingham-tringham. However, despite the fact that it still wasn't nearly strong enough, we supported it, as it was at least a step in the right direction. Madam Deputy Speaker, make no mistake, as we stand here today in this debate on the text of the bill before us, we are now very far away from even that place. Any idea that we're actively debating accountability to human rights, even on the terms originally intended, is blown apart by the very government texts this House is now considering. The government has maintained that it does not need the law to reflect its commitments to human rights, that they wouldn't do anything to compromise it. Further, that its so-called compromise amendment facilitates a new level of commitment. But Madam Deputy Speaker, as soon as one minister pours honey in the public's ears, another drops the mask and lets slip the poisonous truth that condemns those warm words as cozenage. It is clear from the remarks of the Foreign Secretary, who is also the de facto Deputy Prime Minister, that there is absolutely no substance to the government's rhetoric on being champions for human rights at every turn, but that shamefully it is willing to actively pursue an unethical trade policy. If there was ever any doubt about the hollowness to the maxim of global Britain, it's rung out loud and clear in the Foreign Secretary's words. The amendment backed by the government is, of course, completely inadequate in checking its actions. It binds them to naught, and it is crystal clear that the government, in reality, would rather not be subject to any moral position or restriction on its trade policy. In this bill, the government could have committed to maintaining current consumer and labour standards. It turned this chance down, and the public should ask the question, why? Well, the answer is because they're all too willing and ready to sacrifice them to get a deal, any deal. Anyone naive enough to think this isn't the case should look at what is happening with the NHS and human rights. The government could have taken the opportunity to ensure the protection of all aspects of the NHS from private foreign procurement, but it turned the chance down. Why? Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a sign of the times, it's been busy allowing the sale of NHS GP practices to US companies, with Centene Corp, the US health insurance giant, quietly assuming control of the care of 500,000 patients in recent weeks. Donald Trump mercifully may be gone, but few will forget a rare moment of honesty with him confirming that the NHS is on the table in a US-UK trade deal. And we all know it very much still is. His Tory cohorts are still here, and they have earned zero trust over their deeds and actions. Now we see the government looking to shirk its commitments on matching its trade policy to our values in protecting human rights. Why? Again, because of the words of the Foreign Secretary, we know exactly why. The cat is not only out of the bag, it is running feral to alert the world to the fact that to the UK, human rights abuses won't matter. This government will forgive almost anything in its haste to get a deal. Any deal. It turned down the chance to do the right thing. Behind the scenes, we can hear loudly and clearly that this does not matter to the government. Publicly, we can see the government retreating on its legally binding manifesto commitment to international aid spending. This amendment does not do justice to the intentions of the members across all parties that have sought to meet this commitment head-on. The government's empty words on global Britain do not have any bearing on virtually any aspect of its policy in protecting the most vulnerable around the world, determining any notion of responsibility in who the UK sells arms to, or now apparently who we trade with. If this weren't so serious, it would be laughable that this government is trying to rest on laurels that simply don't exist. They should wake up to the reality that the UK's moral standing is already badly damaged. This makes matters worse, and by its actions tonight, this government has done nothing to repair it, but is solely responsible for bringing it into such disrepute. On a day when the UK Food and Drink Federation has published details of exports to the EU of salmon, beef, pork and cheese being savaged by over 80% in the case of salmon, 98%, effectively an utter wipeout of a major Scottish export, yet another poll shows that the people of Scotland have had enough of this attitude, confirming as it does majority support for independence, as does the long-term poll tracking. They are seeing for themselves the twin economic and moral vacuum being created by this Tory government. Looking at this shameful situation, they know that to protect our international trade reputation and to be represented for global citizenship in the way that they want, the only way to achieve that is by Scotland once again joining the international community as an independent nation. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The original question was that this House insists on Commons Amendments 3C and 3D and disagrees with the Lords in their Amendment 3E, since when an amendment has been proposed as on the order paper. The question is that the amendment be made. Dr. Liam Fox.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following that previous intervention, I hope I can return to the subject that we're discussing today. Can I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for her generous words and her accurate quotation. None of us actually believed the process would take quite as long as it did when we began. And can I say to my honourable friend, the member for Wealdon, relating to the point of order she raised about this, I am extremely distressed that she should feel frightened by the intervention of a foreign power in her actions in the House of Commons. But given the level of cyber intrusion in the United Kingdom in general, it's something perhaps we should all be afraid of. Madam Deputy Speaker, there are three brief reasons why I want to support the government's position exactly as I've set out before. First of all, I don't believe that we should make generic law on the basis of specific cases. The history of our legislation is littered with victims of unintended consequence, which I think comes when we undertake that particular action. I believe we should have specific actions for specific issues, such as set out by the Foreign Secretary today in the atrocious way that the Chinese government treats the Uyghurs. And I think that that's the appropriate way to proceed. Secondly, I believe that the House can vote down any free trade agreement through the CRAG process. And if we were to have a preferential free trade agreement that gave greater access to China, to the United Kingdom market than exists under WTO regulations, we already have the ability to block it. I don't believe, for a range of different reasons, that we're likely to see that anytime soon. Certainly, the trade conditions, never mind the human rights conditions, I think would create conditions where that was not going to happen. And thirdly, I do not believe we should restrict the right of the elected government and the House of Commons to implement policies on which they were elected. And it's the point of principle, I'm afraid, that I raised in every single debate that we've had on this so far. Whether it's an unelected Lords Committee of senior judges or the courts themselves, we should want to reject, as the House of Commons, unwarranted intrusion into the rights of democratically elected governments to implement the policies on which they have been elected. And I don't think that we in this House should put down limits on what they can do, and I do not believe, even more, that we should allow elements outside the House of Commons to do so. I believe it sets a constitutional precedent that, for whatever good reasons we would consider these changes today, we would come to regret over time.
Number 6 withdrawn. So, Nusrat Ghani.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know in this place that we should recognise win, so I'm grateful that the government have accepted the principle that it cannot be unaccountable when negotiating trade deals with genocidal states. That is the proposition with the government's Neil Amendment. That we have banked. But the proposed government amendment excludes the Uyghur, which makes no sense considering the very forceful statement made by the Foreign Secretary just a few hours ago. The Foreign Secretary's statement today I welcomed, especially the sanctions. We've also banked that, but the message we're sending now by denying the genocide amendment to tyrannical states is that we have a two-tier genocide system, one which the Uyghur are excluded from. In case it has to be said, Madam Deputy Speaker, I join my colleague for Chingford and Wood Green and East Worthing by formally moving my motion on the order paper today to agree with the Alton Amendment, formerly known as a genocide amendment. I regret I cannot support the government's amendment because it responds to the Uyghur crisis by producing an amendment which excludes them. The government amendment only applies to countries which are formally negotiating a free trade agreement. The genocide amendment excludes the Uyghur. Considering everything that's been said today, I really think this is a shameful way to deal with our international and national responsibilities and fundamentally sends a message that we have a two-tier system in place. I was trying to explain this to my daughter earlier on this morning, and it's like landing a position such as the government putting together a call for evidence on the violence against women and girls and saying we're not going to allow women and girls to give evidence. Let me explain. Uyghur women who are forcing sterilizations at a rate that makes The Handmaid's Tale seem a fairy tale, with a birth rate drop of 84%, a clear marker of genocide, we are saying to Uyghur women, you don't matter. Anyone else but you can present to the Select Committee.
My honourable friend, good way.
Oh, indeed.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend because not only does the government's version of legislation not cater for the Uyghurs at all, but this afternoon's announcement, welcome though it was as an extra step, doesn't include Chen Guangzhou, who, as she knows, is the chief of the Communist Party in Xinjiang, who is the author and architect of some of these genocidal activities going on and needs to be held to account.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, which is why I think it's so important we back the genocide amendment. We give teeth to all the statements made in the House. I know that the President of the World Uyghur Congress has written to many members and said, we do not understand why the UK government would treat us like this, he means the Uyghur, bringing forward a proposal which excludes us in response to a campaign which is all about the suffering of our people. I am grateful for how far the government has moved, but we moved too. I just wanted to ensure the Uyghur people were treated equally to everybody else facing a similar sort of plight. Today we have a historical vote on a simple question. Do we apply genocide policy equal to all people, or do we have a two-tier genocide policy now? The Board of Deputies recently wrote, we are always hesitant, extremely hesitant, to consider the comparisons with the Holocaust and notice similarities of what's happening in China to Nazi Germany. By backing the genocide amendments, we can act when we say never again, by allowing the Uyghur to be included, not excluded, from the government motion. I hope colleagues will join me in the I lobby with the genocide amendment, which really just gives further teeth to the government's earlier sanctions and tidies up a little flaw in the government's amendment which excludes the Uyghur. We cannot have a two-tier genocide process. We move so forward, let's not fall at the last hurdle. And we must and we can be on the right side of history by voting for the genocide amendment.
Yeah.
We now go to Shabana Mahmood.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I support the motion tabled by the member for Wealden and very much appreciate the opportunity this evening for what is essentially a straight vote on the Alton Amendment, which is particularly welcome in light of the procedural shenanigans that prevented this last time. I want to call out the rank hypocrisy of the government in its approach to the whole issue of determining whether a genocide is taking place. They've always ducked the question as to whether the Chinese regime is committing genocide against the Uyghur people in Xinjiang by saying that the determination of genocide is a judicial decision and not a political one. It is something that requires legal determination. The Prime Minister said this when he was the Foreign Secretary, answering Foreign Office questions in November 2017, when he said, and I quote, "Genocide is a strict legal term and we hesitate to deploy it without a proper judicial decision." In fairness, that has been the position of successive governments, but this government knows that there is no international mechanism that will enable a legal determination on genocide against the Uyghurs because China will use its veto. None of the options for competent courts under international law are viable. And now that there is a way forward in a domestic setting with the new Alton Amendment, which in itself is a significant compromise, we are no longer considering a role for the High Court, but one for former senior judges in the House of Lords to make a determination on genocide. The government now say that they are happy to leave this issue to parliamentary select committees instead. This is unconscionable, unacceptable, breathtaking hypocrisy, and the House should take a stand against it today. If the government is acting in good faith, then I cannot think of any reason why they will not accept a role for the judges panel in the House of Lords as per the Alton Amendment. And so, Madam Deputy Speaker, we all have a fundamental judgment to make today. It has nothing to do with constitutional precedent or any other separate actions that the government has announced today, in particular its welcome, though long overdue, decisions in relation to deploying the Magnitsky sanctions regime. It is simply today whether we draw a line in the sand and say that Britain must not do trade deals with countries that commit genocide. That is the only issue that is at stake here today, and that is why I urge all members to vote for the Alton Amendment this evening.
Andrea Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Firstly, I'd like to start by commending the Department for Trade for their fantastic work in continuing to secure free trade agreements around the world. Last week, I hosted a webinar on exporting in partnership with the Department and my right honourable friend, the member for Wakefield. And it was inspiring to hear of the opportunities that our small and medium-sized businesses were taking in boosting skills and jobs in our local areas. With around 6.5 million UK jobs supported by UK exports, it's vital we continue to support and encourage businesses to export, which will help drive a jobs-led recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe that this bill before us updates and builds upon our existing continuity trading relationship that form part of our membership with the EU. I particularly welcome the WTO's agreement on government procurement, which will secure access for UK businesses to overseas procurement opportunities worth £1.3 trillion per year. And I also welcome the new Trade Remedies Authority, which will enable Britain to secure the benefits of freedom while providing a safety net for domestic industries. Madam Deputy Speaker, this country leads the way in making the case for human rights, as proven by my right honourable friend, the member for Esher and Walton's statement this afternoon, and we have not embraced an independent trading policy to do otherwise. So our trading policy must reflect our human rights priorities in a way that is both practical and coherent with our Constitution. Firstly, in order to work effectively, the determination of matters of genocide needs to be practical and follow established methods. As a result, it is perfectly reasonable for this judgment to rest with the competent courts, which include domestic criminal courts and relevant international courts, rather than for governments or non-judicial bodies. We all support the objective of upholding human rights. It is a question of how we achieve that best in practice. As my right honourable friend, the member for Chelsea and Fulham, already stated, the government has listened and given assurance that Parliament and Select Committee chairs will be part of the process to establish new joint committees or subcommittees or bringing in the expertise of former members of the judiciary. Amendments proposed by the other place, however, would create a wrecking ball situation in which the High Court would fundamentally challenge a royal prerogative. In my view, such a move will undermine our confidence in Parliament. Brexit was about strengthening this voice that Parliament has. This bill and the amendment made by my right honourable friend, the member for Chislehurst, gives a clear role for Parliament to act quickly and decisively in human rights situations, whilst also seizing the new global opportunities ahead.
Video link to Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade pointed out earlier, we have had many debates in this place about this trade bill, but today there is only one question before us, and that is, should the UK have trade deals, have agreements with countries that practice genocide on their own peoples? It seems very, very clear to me and to my fellow members of the Liberal Democrats that we need to grab this opportunity as it's presented to us here today to make that very, very clear statement. We welcome the statement by the Foreign Secretary earlier today about the Magnitsky sanctions, but we absolutely must follow that up and make it so clear in everything that we do that we do not tolerate genocide in any shape or form. So the Liberal Democrats remain unflinching in our support of Lord Alton's amendment, and we welcome the fact that their lordships have once again returned this bill to the Commons with this amendment. And I urge the government to listen to all the cross-party voices on this issue and allow the amendment to stand. Time is short, so I will not rehearse all the reasons why this genocide amendment is so necessary in combating the actions of the regimes against their own peoples, such as we are currently seeing against the Uyghurs in China at this very moment. It continues to baffle me that this government, which fought so hard for the rights of the UK to agree its own trade deals, has so little to say about how it plans to use that power. It has resisted calls from across the House to use the power of our trade deals to demand environmental, social, or human rights improvements from our trading partners. How can we ensure that our goods and services will not be cheaply traded away? The government will not even allow this amendment. The government's objections to the original amendment have been ably addressed by their lordships, and we will be voting for this amendment tabled by a member for Wealden this evening. Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I would have no hesitation in voting against a trade deal with a state that commits genocide. I'd also have no hesitation in voting against a trade deal with a state which has oppressive behaviours and conduct which fall short of the legal definition of genocide. But either way, those are political decisions and should be taken here, and therefore we need a political process to deal with those. And that's why, despite the changes, there still remain difficulties with the latest iteration that comes back from their lordships. And the problem is given away actually by the language, which was recognised perhaps by the Shadow Secretary of State when she referred to a finding by our country's most experienced judges. And that's actually the rub of the wording of the amendment. When it talks in terms of a parliamentary judicial committee, when it talks in terms of preliminary determination, later defined as a public finding, those are the languages of courts rather than of parliaments. And the game is further revealed, or the attention is further revealed, more accurately, by Clause 10, subsection A, subsection 1, which specify the procedure by which judges may be appointed to the Parliamentary Judicial Committee. But of course that's constitutionally inaccurate, leave behind anything else. Because once former members of the judiciary sit in the other place, they sit there as former members, no longer as judges. They have ceased their judicial function. To pass this amendment would actually be constitutionally illiterate on its current wording. And whilst the expertise of the former members of the judiciary is very great and very welcome, it's surely objectionable in principle to create a parliamentary committee upon only which one class of member of either house can serve and be cut by reference purely to their previous occupation. Secondly, it seems to me undesirable that by statute we shall seek to circumscribe so closely both the membership of a committee of either house or the proceedings by which such a committee operates, which normally should be a matter for standing orders. And I would have thought that was much the better way by which to go. Time is very... I'll give way to the Secretary of State since I referred to her speech, but then I'm speaking.
Something that's always concern me about the Right Honourable Gentleman's amendment, though, is that he refers, it's for select committees to make decisions about whether or not there has been genocide, but we've heard from the chairs of the select committees that would be the primary candidates who've all said that they don't think that they're up to it and they don't feel that they have sufficient experience and that it would be the sort of thing that someone with judicial experience would be able to do better.
Then, of course, they would lead the Right Honourable Lady back into the constitutional problem that was recognised and rejected by this House on the previous occasion with the first version of the Alton Amendment. And secondly, what I posit the better way forward is this, and that's to use the standing orders of this House to set up a joint committee of both Houses to scrutinise the matter. And that could, of course, from the crossbench members of the other House, include members of the House of Lords with former judicial experience, but they will be there as members of the House, not as former judges, and that's their proper constitutional position. And none of them have sought to suggest that they will be doing so otherwise, very correctly. I'm sorry, time presses. I've given way once, and it wouldn't be fair upon other people with respect. I hope that when the Minister comes to respond to debate, he will make clear that the government would facilitate the bringing forward of motions to enable the establishment of such a joint committee of both Houses, and I hope very much then that members of the other place with high judicial experience might well lend their expertise to that. The obvious precedent is the work of the Joint Committee on Human Rights, ably chaired by the Right Honourable Lady and Member for Camberwell and Peckham. Over the years, that has established a very high reputation for its rigour of scrutiny, the quality of its decision-making and the respect in which it is held. It's inconceivable that such a committee would be ignored by any government on an issue as important and significant as potential genocide by a potential trading partner. I'd urge the government to take that as the right way forward, rather than falling into a well-intended, totally well-intended, but nonetheless undesirable constitutional trap of yet again this latest iteration of the amendment.
Have you given way? Or...
I thought he'd just go. I'm grateful to help him. Can I just say to him, he of course is making a speech which contradicts government position right now, because of course the government itself does not believe that what this House or a joint House would do is decide that genocide has taken place. So he, in a sense, is quite a long way towards our amendment.
I fear my right honourable friend misunderstands, I'm sure inadvertently, because in fact my stance is entirely consistent with that of the government, because it would be for the select committees to refer the matter to the joint committee, and that would then take a view as to where the potentially genocide had been taken place, but then that would be a matter which informed the House ultimately as to whether or not it decided to go through with the signing off of a trade agreement. And of course, even under the Cragg process, this House has controls over that matter. So there is actually, with respect to my right honourable friend, no contradiction at all. The nonsense would actually be to have a situation where you seek to create, however well intended, a quasi-court, I won't say quasi-judicial, a quasi-court in the other place through the language of this amendment. That actually would do, I suspect, more harm than the good that is intended by it. And I hope if the government will make clear their intentions to facilitate the setting up of a joint committee, we have a better and altogether more suitable resolution.
Video link to Mari Rimmer.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Sorry, I seem to have gone.
I think we can hear the Honourable Lady. She wants to continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Genocide is the most horrific act of barbarity that human beings are capable of. In 20 years' time, I probably will not be around, but most members will be. By then, the true horrors of what the Chinese regime is doing in Xinjiang will be known by all. Each member of this House will want to look back with the knowledge that when presented with the opportunity to do something, they took it. When we hear the word genocide, we think of the Nazi concentration camps, gas chambers, and the horrors of the Holocaust. What is happening in Xinjiang is more subtle. It is genocide by stealth, forced sterilisation, the forcible transfer of children, and forced labour camps, all of a specific ethnic group. In this case, it is the Uyghurs. In this case, it is genocide. The Genocide Amendment will help us to prevent our nation being complicit with genocidal regimes. The status quo of determining genocide is not good enough. It is foolish to rely on the International Criminal Court. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, China will veto any trial. Imagine a murder suspect vetoing their own trial. The situation is ludicrous. It's now been 75 years since the Nuremberg trials. In that time, our country has never succeeded in recognising genocide while it was happening. This is our chance to do it. In January, I joined with members across this House to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to say never again to genocide. Now is the time to take action, to put those words into practice. I appeal to all members of this House to consider your vote carefully and to vote with your conscience. In years to come, no member wants to look back with regret. Do not be party to this Parliament looking the other way. Thank you.
It's withdrawn, so we go to Geraint Davis.
Hello?
Geraint Davis, do go ahead.
Oh, sorry about that, Madam Deputy Speaker. Tonight, the government has to decide whether it allows Parliament to intervene in terms of trade deals, specifically in relation to genocide. And we've all heard the stories about mass rape, concentration camps, people unable to have babies, brainwashing, cultural genocide. And the issue here is whether Parliament is given the ability, on the basis of evidence, to restrict trade in these situations. Now, last time, of course, we had a Lords Amendment which said that the courts should provide the evidence, decide whether there's conclusive evidence of genocide, and then we, the politicians in Parliament, would decide what we did about it, whether we restricted trade or not. It was said that those weren't competent courts. Of course, if you say competent courts are only international courts, then China can veto them, and it defeats the object. It was said that that was judicial interference in Parliament, when of course it wasn't. And now the Lords have come out with a new amendment, says fair enough, if that's the way you see it, we'll have a committee making decisions on the basis of concrete evidence, judicially prepared in essence. And now the government is saying, oh, well, you can't do that because that's a judiciary interfering with Parliament. Well, I mean, you can't have it both ways. And it does seem, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this is, in essence, an intentional evasion by the government to prevent Parliament in its, solemn duty to defend our intrinsic values. And I certainly don't accept the point made by the man for North Somerset that the government's somehow got some sort of mandate to muzzle debate and to blur scrutiny. We must be free to debate and decide based on the evidence. The government must explain what they're doing if trade continues with perpetrators of genocide. And we should know, yes, the economic costs of protecting our values and to decide whether to act. These are fundamental questions of humanity, and the government has no right to quash or stifle our parliamentary duty to consider them. The fundamental questions, are we going to bow to the power of China and sort of backroom deals, or are we going to rejoice and empower Britain's greatest gift to the world, robust and unfettered parliamentary debate on the basis of sound evidence to make key decisions and when and whether to put our values for our economic interests? I think we are obliged morally to support this amendment, and I certainly will be.
The last speaker, before I call the Minister, is Paul Howell. We go to Paul Howell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a member of the BAE Select Committee, who have recently produced our report on Uyghur forced labour in Xinjiang and UK value chains, I understand the concerns lodged around trading with countries where genocide is suspected to be happening, or in particular where it's felt almost certain it is happening. The supply chains of all companies operating in this space need to either dramatically increase their capability and delivery of transparency or accept the presumption that they're profiteering from exploitation. It's who determines getting past the key statement of whether genocide is happening in law that this amendment questions, and my belief is that it's quite clear that the place for this determination is in the courts. The government has been consistently clear it's for competent courts, not committees, to make determinations of genocide. I do not believe that it needs a trade agreement discussion to engage actions on concerns as significant as genocide, and I welcome the statement earlier by the Foreign Secretary in taking steps along with our partners where evidence is apparent of actions incompatible with our values. I wholeheartedly support his words. Indeed, I would encourage him to go further. I believe the Neil Amendment meets the concerns raised around parliamentary scrutiny in that it should be a credible concern of genocide be raised within a country we are proposing a new free trade agreement with. It ensures that a debate and a vote in Parliament will result. Credible reports rather than determination is a lower level of proof for stimulating this intervention, and this is wholly appropriate, as the practical difficulties in proving genocidal intent mean that genocide is very difficult to prove even when apparently obvious. I'm convinced, I do apologise, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I've gone to the wrong place. I'm convinced of the need for us to ensure that any new free trade agreements should not be made with countries where there is a credible concern of genocide, or indeed of any other significant human rights issues. But I'm not convinced this amendment is the mechanism by which it should be done. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It has been a good but short debate. As my right honourable friend, the member for North Somerset, said, the amendment from the other place will have significant unintended consequences, creating a so-called parliamentary judicial committee, destabilising the balance of powers between Parliament and judiciary, whilst not actually helping those suffering at the hands of the Chinese authorities or those elsewhere in the world. When it comes to China, the UK is leading action internationally. And as we saw earlier in this House, the Foreign Secretary, who had already announced a series of targeted measures in respect of UK supply chains and trade, and earlier today, with concerted international action with Magnitsky sanctions with 29 of our friends and allies, we will continue to hold China to account for its actions in Xinjiang. But let us not forget, Madam Deputy Speaker, that this trade bill is a hugely important and necessary piece of legislation for the UK economy. The sooner we enact this bill, the sooner importers, exporters and the general public can harness the benefit that this bill brings. But let us not forget, it is the trade bill. It is about trade, and I'm going to return to that in just a second. We heard from the shadow front bench, who spoke. She spoke eloquently about human rights abuses in Xinjiang, and I agreed with every word of what she described. However, less than a year ago, Madam Deputy Speaker, she was urging, or seemingly urging us, to do a trade deal with China. From that dispatch box on the 12th of May 2020, she attacked the government for engaging in negotiations with the United States. She said she will not agree measures with the United States, quote, which would constrain the UK's ability to negotiate our own trade agreement with China. Quoted from Hansard. No, it's in Hansard. She shouldn't have said it if she didn't want to say it. So she is opposed to a trade deal with the United States in case it jeopardised a trade deal with China. We heard from my honourable friend, the member for Worthing, who asked, it's difficult to see what position the government would agree with. Well, I would say, Madam Deputy Speaker, that we agree with the amendment put forward by my honourable friend, the member for Bromley and Chislehurst. We heard from others, what does this do to help the Uyghurs? Well, this is a trade bill. It's mainly about the continuity of previous EU trade agreements and trade defences and trade data. We don't have a free trade agreement with China. We have no plans or intention to negotiate a free trade agreement with China. There is no historic free trade agreement with China. And none of this is even in the range of the bill as was written. But nor is it clear to me, with the Alton Amendment, that there is a significant agreement in scope to cancel. This is a trade bill dealing with free trade agreements. There is no FTA with China. And that is why Xinjiang and the Uyghurs would not be in scope of the trade bill. Instead, Madam Deputy Speaker, that is why the Foreign Secretary and others are taking the tough action that we propose. We heard from the SNP, which was more about the EU, Brexit and Donald Trump than about trade, China or the Uyghurs. My right honourable friend, the member for Chingford and Wood Green, and my honourable friend, the member for Wealdon, talked passionately about the cause. But the Parliamentary Judicial Committee would be given a new power in law to make a determination of genocide. The government cannot agree with that. Instead, we agree with the approach made by my honourable friend, the member for Bromley and Chislehurst, who describes the Parliamentary Judicial Committee as being constitutionally illiterate. The government would facilitate such motions, as he asked, to allow select committees to set up a subcommittee to examine these issues if the Select Committee chose to do that, Madam Deputy Speaker. That is the most important point. I hope that honourable members can now come together to underscore our support for this approach in place of the approach proposed by the other place and pass once more the amendment in the name of the Chair of the Justice Select Committee.
The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. No. Division, clear the lobby. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. Of the contrary, no. Tellers for the ayes, Jeff Smith and Bambos Charalambos. Tellers for the noes, Maria